Welcome to part 11 of Introduction to Philosophy, Plato's Apology and Phaedo. Once again, I have to apologize. I was reviewing the last talk and I said Introduction to Sociology. It's not that, it's philosophy. Although I do talk from time to time about, say, Durkheim, compare him to Hegel, compare him to Popper's objective knowledge in Three Worlds. Max Weber pops up, and of course Marx, all three major sociological theorists. And I do, of course, approach philosophy from a PP&E, politics, philosophy, and economics standpoint. So that's not entirely off base, but this is indeed philosophy class. Now, the Apology. Have you not read it? Ah, well, I so envy you because you have such a treat in store. This is a wonderful dialogue. It shows off Socrates at the height of his powers, if not necessarily at his best. And of course, it doesn't turn out well for Socrates, but it's still something. You haven't had an education unless you've read through Plato's Apology. So let's do that. Bethany Hughes has a great book on Socrates called The Hemlock Cup. And she says this about Socrates. Socrates, what a donut subject. Gloriously rich with a whacking hole in the middle where the central character should be. I like Bethany Hughes' work. She is like I am. She likes to go visit the places she talks about, writes about. So she goes to visit, for example, the various battlefields on which Socrates had fought when he was a young man. I haven't yet done that. I've been to some of the sites, Athens and the Peloponnese and the Conflates and so forth. But you know, it's always good to be able to visualize and bring back photos to show our students, of course. She does that as well. So who was this character, Socrates? Well, this is such a simple question that it could be an exam question at Oxford, and often is. People have had various opinions about Socrates over the years. Some have worshipped him. Socrates, says Shelley, was the Jesus Christ of Greece. Mankind, says John Stuart Mill, can hardly be too often reminded that there was once a man named Socrates, between whom and the legal authorities and public opinion of his time took place a memorable collision. Academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced disobedience, says Martin Luther King. On the other hand, he's got his detractors. Socrates was rabble, says Nietzsche. Socrates was a big chatterbox who tried to make himself the tyrant of his country, to dissolve its customs, and to entice its citizens into forming opinions contrary to law and order. Cato the Elder. And we have the problem also, who's behind the scenes? This is not just a problem with Socrates, it comes up with lots of historical figures. Shakespeare, for example, the canonical superstar of English lit. Here he has a bust in the ruins of an old church in the city of London. It's ruined because, of course, the Germans bombed it into rubble. But his friends had put the statue up in the garden of the church to make sure that their friend Shakespeare was not forgotten. As indeed he has not been. There's Christ, the object of faith, the savior of mankind. Here he is in a stained glass window, memorialized, but of course, there's many other memorials. And Socrates, culture hero, star of Plato's dramas. And all three of these figures have these public personas, but who's behind the scenes? Behind Shakespeare was Will, a country bumpkin from Stratford, a little provincial town, rake about London, credited with some plays which he may or may not have wrote. If you've seen the film Shakespeare in Love, you've got some sense of what the discrepancy there might have been. Jesus, the Galilean peasant of history, how did he become the Christ of faith? And Socrates. Roger Scruton is a curmudgeonly English philosopher, has an interesting book, Xantipic Dialogues. You know, Plato wrote various dialogues with Socrates. What if Socrates was seen from the standpoint of his wife, Xanthippe? Well, he might look very, very different. He does he's a lazy, shiftless, loitering Athenian husband. She has to support the family, as indeed she did in real life. She calls him Socks, a nickname that he hates. But Will behind Shakespeare, Jesus behind Christ, Socks behind Socrates. Who was the real person? This was a major question in theology concerning Jesus. Can we peel back the Christ of faith to uncover who the Jesus of history was? That debate went on throughout the 19th century. In 1905, Albert Schweitzer, the famous Albert Schweitzer, sums this up in a book called The Quest for the Historical Jesus, and he concluded, no, we'll never get behind the Christ of faith to the real kernel back there, the Jesus of history, which has not stopped people trying since there was in recent decades a Jesus seminar convened by a variety of biblical scholars of a variety of denominational faiths, and they tried to decide which of the actual sayings of Jesus and which were not. Of course, that was prior to that. Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century had put out what he called the Jefferson Bible. He took a razor blade and he cut out all the things in the New Testament which he thought were not the actual sayings of Jesus. It turned out to be a very slim volume. But after Schweitzer in 1925, Bruce Barton, an American businessman, wrote a book called The Man Nobody Knows. And he says, I can tell you who Jesus was. Here's who he was. He was the original CEO of the modern corporation and the 12 disciples, his board of directors. The man nobody knows. So we can ask the same question. Who was the real person Socks behind Socrates, the culture hero? It's an analogous problem, and it's a difficult problem. I've alluded to some of the difficulties earlier, for example, in talking about the goal of our knowledge. We can see that there are some words that Plato puts in the mouth of Socrates that don't correspond to other things we might gather about Socrates. We have to read between the lines at best. The Socrates of the Delphic Oracle story is not consistent with the Socrates of Anaxagoras, which we encounter in the Meno. Plato thinks there are eternal forms in which we have knowledge. Socrates thinks that no one, himself included, knows anything. When Socrates asks Euthyphro, you recall the characteristic Platonic question, what's the essential form of the holy? Neither of them comes up with an answer, and that's not where Plato surely wanted to go. They get instead aporia, a lack of closure. And this is what Socrates always gets in these dialogues, but again, not perhaps what Plato was hoping for. So Socrates was, as we can gather, a bit of a curmudgeon. Maybe Plato made it a little bit nicer, but some of Socrates comes through in Plato's account. Rather like Winston Churchill. They tell lots of stories about Churchill. One of them was a fellow member of Parliament gets up in Parliament one day and calls Churchill a dirty dog. And the man's name was Paling. Paling is in England a word that refers to like a picket fence post. And Churchill gets up and he says, the right honorable gentleman will remember what dirty dogs do to palings. Socrates, I think, was rather like that. And Socrates is one of these people who we know about, even though he's not written anything. Jesus was the same way. Confucius also, Buddha, Muhammad, Guru, Nanak, all influential without having written anything. On the subject of Socrates and Jesus, there have been many comparisons. Shelley's Jesus Christ of Greece I've already quoted. Both Socrates and Jesus were teachers. Both were executed as criminals. Both had followers who thought this was unjust and wanted to write down their story to keep them alive for posterity. And of course, both groups succeeded. On the other hand, there's at least one big difference concerning Socrates and Jesus as teachers, and that's this. The more Jesus you get, the more Jesus you need. I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. And so Jesus must be with you always. But the more Socrates you get, the less Socrates you need. As a teacher, Socrates fades away. You become your own Socrates. That's the point. After a while, you don't need to enroll in classes and pay the credit hours, etc. You can learn to learn. And if you've taken the hint from Socrates, that's exactly what you will do. So, Socrates' family. I mentioned his wife, Xanthippe. The name means blonde horse. It's an aristocratic name. She was a bit younger, a lot younger than Socrates, maybe 40 years. There are various stories about her. We can't be sure about them. One of them is that she poured the chamber pot over his head. Well, chamber pot is kind of archaic. In the days before indoor plumbing, one would keep a pot underneath the bed in case one needed to relieve oneself at night. And so it had to be emptied in the morning. Here she is emptying the chamber pot over Socrates' head. And he's supposed to have said, "Oh, well, I should have known that rain follows thunder." Xanthippus' name becomes synonymous with the shrew. Socrates supposedly said, "If you get a good wife, you become happy. If you get a bad wife, you become truly happy, for you become a philosopher." And apart from not being nice, this seems particularly ungrateful because Socrates, and he'll tell you this several times in the Apology, is not interested in making money. He does not get paid for his teaching services. Poor Xanthippe had to support the family, kind of like a rabbi's wife in the old days. Her husband could study, she kept the family together and earned the bread. They had three sons, apparently: Lamprocles, Sophronicus, named after Socrates' father, and Menexenus. Aristotle says of Socrates' descendants, they turned out silly and dull. It's often the fate of professors. I had a favorite professor, a first generation in his family, went to Harvard, very proud of it, wanted his sons to follow in his footsteps. One of them wanted to become a tennis pro, the other wanted to become an auto mechanic. But that is one family business, apparently, which it's hard to pass along. Now, Socrates grew up in the glory days of Athens, 5th century. His city went from the height of its power and prestige to a great decline. Military defeat, political terror and repression, and reconstruction. Pericles was the leader of Athens during Socrates' day and the war leader during the Peloponnesian War. The Parthenon, the great temple to Athena, was built by the Athenian craftsmen during his lifetime. And by the way, this is possibly what it looked like. Now, we talked about this before. The Greeks polychromed their statues. They painted their white marble statues gaudy colors. They did the same thing with their other marble as well. Of course, up in the top right hand is what it looks like today. Very, very different. Athens was the first democracy in Greece and famous for democracy, dating to Cleisthenes Isonomia. But it was also deeply stratified, and there were lots of class conflicts, particularly during Socrates' lifetime, particularly during the period of the trial. There was the old Homeric distinction between the blessed few, the aristos, meaning the best. That's where our word aristocracy comes from, the rule of the best. And then there was the multitude, hoi polloi, the many, mob, all of which, of course, were included in the democracy. Athens was a democracy. Sparta, by contrast, its main rival, was a dictatorship. These two cities were enemies. Conservative Athenians who disliked their democracy were often pro-Spartan. We'll come back to that. And class tension was heightened up to the time of Socrates' trial. The aristocracy versus the small farmers and the artisans who supported the democracy. The Democrats, up through the rule of Pericles, began pushing back. And we see this, for example, in the way in which the courts changed. There was the Areopagus, the old aristocratic court, supplanted by the new people's court, the Helaia. And this is where Socrates, the Helaia, is going to be tried. The Peloponnesian War takes place during Socrates' lifetime. The population of Athens declined by about 1/3. Not only because of the war, but as we'll see, because of a plague that decimated the population. Also, although Athens was a democracy, it was notoriously a slave democracy. About 1/3 of the residents were entirely unfree. There were also metics, resident aliens. They weren't full citizens, but they weren't slaves either, however, they did not have legal standing. Women and children were not counted as citizens. They weren't even really thought of as fully humans. So if we look at the male citizens in blue, as a percentage of the residents of Athens, those who really counted, were about 14%. The rest were women, children, metics, and slaves. Of the free male citizens living in Athens, of that 14% or so, those who could vote, in other words, This in turn was divided into middle class and lower classes and an upper class. And again, you can see the proportions there. The upper class, the aristocrats, leisure class, potential consumers of philosophy, art, and poetry. These were the people from whom Socrates drew his students. Bertie Russell makes the following comment about the age of Pericles. Plato's young men, he says, who have no need to work, spend most of their leisure time in the pursuit of science and mathematics and philosophy. They know Homer almost by heart and are critical judges of the merits of professional reciters of poetry. The art of deductive reasoning had lately been discovered and afforded the excitement of new theories, both true and false, over the whole field of knowledge. It was possible in that age, as in few others, to be both intelligent and happy through intelligence. Bliss was it in that day to be alive. Among the many young men, rich young men who flocked to Socrates was Alcibiades, Plato himself, and Plato's kinsman Critias. And these guys are going to figure, obviously Plato, but Alcibiades and Critias in the story of Socrates and his trial. He will be accused of corrupting the youth of the city. Critias and Alcibiades may be the intended folk there. Alcibiades, interesting guy. He was an aristocrat. We'll hear from him a little bit later. He led Athens during the Peloponnesian War. Then he defected, went over to the Spartan enemy, and then defected in turn from the Greeks to the enemy of all the Greeks, Persia, before finally being recalled to Athens, was engaged in a disastrous campaign against Sicily. After Sparta eventually defeated Athens, spoiler alert, Critias, Plato's cousin, led a dictatorship known as the 30 Tyrants, and that again is going to figure into the story. So both of these two made enemies among partisans of the Athenian democracy. Socrates was thought to be behind them. That's probably again the basis of that one charge against him. The 5th century was the height of Athenian power and prestige. The Peloponnesian War, starting 431 before the Common Era, and the aftermath of the war destroyed that and decimated the male population. You can see here from the map, the Athenian League is in brown, goes all throughout the Aegean Sea and the Cyclades, includes Crete. The Spartan Peloponnesian League, basically, Thebes, north of Athens, Corinth, Sparta, on the Peloponnese itself. A bit of a smaller empire, but still they had influenced the cities beyond their own city walls. Eventually, Sparta is going to defeat Athens, and it's going to impose some very harsh conditions upon them, including a dictatorship. It wasn't the worst they could have done. Corinth and Thebes wanted the Athenians to be enslaved, and that was sometimes the outcome of wars among these city-states. But the Spartans says, no, they're too noble for that. The Spartans drew a distinction between enemies and villains, for example. Incidentally, the Spartan word for themselves, Lacedaemon, shows up. They had that letter L. Looks like an angle to us, but that's their letter L on their shield. So you could always tell the Spartans. They were laconic, as the term has it. Okay, well, let's look at a video clip about that war and how the two forces were pitted against each other, how it worked out, and what the aftermath was.
The war between Athens, leader of the Delian League of Allied City-States and Colonies, against Sparta, leader of the Peloponnesian League, pitted a powerful navy against one of the most dominant infantry forces in history. Preceding this conflict, Athens had defeated a Persian invasion force at the Battle of Marathon. A decade later, a much larger Persian invasion force suffered major setbacks and defeats at Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans famously fought to the last man. Then at Salamis, the Persians were dealt a major naval defeat against the Athenian navy. And finally at Plataea, the Persian army was defeated on land, before downsizing and eventually abandoning the campaign. For the next half-century, both states followed an anti-Persian policy and supported any anti-Persian activities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Allowing for an intermittent peace to exist between Athens and Sparta. In order to fight the Persians at sea, the Athenians formed the Delian League. By exercising more and more control over the members of the league, Athens converted this coalition into an empire, exacting tribute from its members. From the money extracted from her client states, Athens built herself into a city that was the envy of the Hellenistic world, and a fleet of 300 triple-banked galleys. Each of these triremes was manned by a crew of 170 professional oarsmen. The city-state of Corinth had been the dominant maritime power prior to the Persian Wars, and as Athens' power grew, her navy outnumbered Corinth's fleet 3-1, and began to incite rebellion in her colonies and encroach on its trade routes. In a series of small conflicts lasting 15 years, known as the First Peloponnesian War, Sparta opposed Athens and defeated the Athenian army in one non-decisive engagement. While Athens continued to expand her naval power, one significant development during this period was the rebuilding of Athens' walls on a grand scale, with a long causeway connecting Athens with the port city of Piraeus, allowing Athens to be fully supplied by sea, even if an invading army would destroy the surrounding countryside and farmland. This hostile period ended with the so-called 30 Years' Peace between the two city-states that would last for less than half of its intended duration. Despite this peace, hostility between Athens and Corinth continued, and in 431 BC, Corinth successfully convinced Sparta and the Peloponnesian League to declare war on Athens, with the goal of ending the burgeoning Athenian Empire. The first phase of the Second Peloponnesian War, commonly referred to as simply the Peloponnesian War, is known as the Archidanian War, where Sparta pursued a policy of pillaging the countryside around Athens in an attempt to provoke a pitched battle. The Athenians had anticipated the Spartan strategy and had organized a continuous flow of grain shipments from Egypt and colonies on the Aegean and Black Sea coasts. The Athenian strategy was to blockade the Peloponnesian Peninsula from any trade and supplies, while opportunistically raiding Sparta's allies. While initially the Athenians seemed to be maintaining the upper hand in this asymmetric war of attrition that had been carefully planned for years by the Athenian statesman Pericles, the population from the surrounding countryside poured in behind the safety of the Athenian walls in the early stages of the war. This had been taken into account beforehand, and wealthy Athens had more than enough food flowing into the crowded city to feed everyone. What had not been taken into account was tainted grain shipments carrying plague, which rapidly spread through the overcrowded city. Initially, the city was resilient, inspired by the charismatic rhetoric of Pericles. An estimated 1 in 4 Athenians succumbed to the plague, including Pericles and his sons, before it had run its course. At the height, mercenaries refused to fight for Athens, and even the Spartans ceased to campaign near Athens for fear of catching the plague. Ironically, the masterfully planned Athenian blockade of the Peloponnese had protected Sparta and its allies from receiving any of the plague-tainted grain. The Athenian survivors adopted a much more aggressive strategy, greatly increasing their raids and building fortified outposts along the Peloponnesian coast. The Helots, Spartan slaves that outnumbered them 10-1, were encouraged to run away to these outposts, which put pressure on Sparta to defend the home front. This phase of the war ended with the 50-year Peace of Nicias, which never really went into full effect, with both belligerents raiding each other through proxies from the onset, and eventually directly. In 415 BC, the Athenians devised a plan they believed would bestow upon themselves an overwhelming advantage: the conquest of the fabulously wealthy city-state of Syracuse on the island of Sicily, who along with Athens and Carthage controlled the lion's share of Mediterranean trade. Led by the young charismatic Athenian statesman Alcibiades, the expedition ended in disaster, with Athens losing over 10,000 hoplites and 2/3 of her navy. Ships could be rebuilt, but the 30,000 professional oarsmen could not be replaced. This was followed by further disasters. Sparta freed 20,000 Athenian slaves in the city's silver mines. Athens then raised the tribute from her vassals, which caused widespread revolt in Ionia, for which this final stage of the war is named. The Athenian general Alcibiades, fearing retribution for his failure, switched sides and fought for Sparta, who began to receive vast sums of money from the Persian Empire, who viewed the Athenian Empire as a greater threat. With this, Sparta built up its fleet and combined with its Corinthian allies, decisively defeated the Athenian navy at Aegospotami. Athens, now effectively without a navy, was besieged by Sparta and promptly surrendered. Spartan hegemony over the Greek world would be short-lived. Its most precious resource, Spartan warriors, had become far too low to maintain an empire. And after a series of smaller wars, in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, Philip of Macedon, the father of Alexander the Great, was able to conquer the decimated Greek city-states.
Yes, so there's a brief history of the circumstances leading up to the point of the trial of Socrates. Talk about your unintended consequences. We talked about that earlier in the Meno dialogue. We'll show you, we'll import all this grain from Egypt. Well, that didn't work out quite so well. And you can read this if you want to, pause it as you will. Okay, the 30 tyrants, the dictatorship installed in Athens, limited the number of voters, restricted basically the democratic base, and restricted those eligible for trial by jury to the oligos, the rich and the aristocratic. And there was a death squad period here, basically. Bettany Hughes compares it to the Central America in the 1980s with the Contra situation, the Balkans in the 1990s. There were, lots of vendettas. The leader of the 30 tyrants, Critias, was a student of Socrates and a relative of Plato. Now, Socrates, as he'll tell us in the Apology, did not side with the 30 openly. Indeed, he actually defied them, but he didn't go into exile either, as the Democrats did, in order to organize a resistance. So he was seen as at least being friendly to the Democrats' enemy. Socrates is a conservative. Plato is an aristocrat. We'll see, Plato was not. Plato was well-born, Socrates was not. Neither of them are really friends of the restored democracy once the tyrants are overthrown. And of course, Socrates' students, Alcibiades and Critias, have been leaders in overthrowing the democracy in the first place. There's an amnesty declared for people from the war and the tyranny, but there is still some suggestion that the year 399, when Socrates is put on trial, is payback time. And payback can be a bitch. If you know anything about the reprisals that took place, for example, after the liberation of France in 1944, women who slept with German soldiers were publicly shamed, stripped naked, had their heads shaved, covered with tar and feathers. Men were put up in pelotons, firing posts basically in the town square, and shot publicly. Socrates himself, although he was a conservative politically, was not an aristocrat per se. He came from fairly humble origins. His father, Sophoniscus, was a stonemason. His mother, Phaedo, was a midwife. And he makes a great to-do about his voluntary poverty. So Socrates comes from basically the lower middle working class. His friends, though, were aristocrats by birth. Plato was, Alcibiades was, Critias was. He ate with them at their houses, drank with them at their expense. As we'll see toward the end, some of them actually offer to pay his fine at the trial. And all in all, Socrates carries on as an aristocrat. He scorns democracy. He scorns the many in favor of the few. We'll see he makes some rather undiplomatic comments in this regard in his trial. Being tried in that democracy, which was restored after the rule of the 30 tyrants, one might argue that Socrates, putting on the aristocratic airs that he did, can hardly but work against him. Now, let's talk about the legal system in Athens before we talk about the actual trial. We already talked about this a little bit when we talked about the Euthyphro dialogue, right? When Euthyphro was actually prosecuting his own father, and Socrates was having to do his own defense against charges brought by some other individuals. The system of law and justice in Athens was different. In general, we could contrast Athens as an example of an archaic system of law with our own system as an example of a modern system of law, and they're very different. Let's just look at this in detail. 4 principles of archaic law: particularism, amateurism, sin and crime are related, and act morality operates. Particularism. different laws and different punishments by social status. If you were a slave versus free person, if you were a native person versus a foreigner, you would receive different treatment, including different methods of execution if it came down to the death penalty. Blood is thicker than water, the vendetta notion of justice. We saw that in the Unifro case. Amateurism. Individual citizens prosecute and defend. The democracy in Athens is a direct democracy. They don't elect representatives, but rather each citizen speaks in the assembly. And again, we'll talk about that a little more. There's no professional lawyer class, and so therefore also no judges. If you are accused of something, you must be able to speak in your own defense. It's presumed that you will. If a foreigner is accused, they're not, being a citizen, allowed to do that, which is one of the reasons for the host-guest system that prevailed. If you go to a foreign city, you better be sure that you're under the protection of someone who is a citizen, lest you be accused of a crime, because if you're accused of a crime and you don't have a citizen to speak for you in court on your behalf, then you can be summarily sentenced to things like slavery. It's not a happy outcome. Sin and crime. We draw great distinctions between things like sin, crime, and nuisance. They didn't. And think about the religious nature of the proceedings in the Unifro case. Unifro's father, when he wants to know what to do, does he go for a lawyer? No, he goes for a seer, an exegetus. This is a religious figure. Socrates and Unifro discuss justice as if it were a religious matter. They talk about it in terms of holiness, piety, and the like. And then act morality. We've talked about this again before. Acts are taboo, blameworthy without respect to intentions or mitigating circumstances. Under modern law, by contrast, the principles are correspondingly universalism, professionalism. Crime is not a sin. There's a distinction drawn, and intention morality rules. Under a universalistic system, law and punishment are the same for all. No man is above the law. Justice is impersonal. No person can take the law into their own hands. We have a saying in our world: any lawyer who defends himself has a fool for a client. And that's our conventional wisdom, but it was very different from theirs. We have a public defender if somebody can't afford a lawyer, otherwise they pay for a lawyer. We have a public prosecutor, district attorney, whatever, paid by the state to prosecute crimes. But again, they didn't. It was all done by individual citizens. In our way of thinking, modern systems of law, crimes must be acts. You can't be prosecuted for a thought. You can't be prosecuted for a belief. You have to actually do something. And these need to be prescribed in advance by specific written statutes. Usually the penalties are also specified. Just being obnoxious or just being irreligious is not enough to make you a criminal in a truly modern system of law. And finally, intention morality prevails. We talked about this before. Mens rea. It not only matters what act a person commits, a crime has to be an act, but there can be mitigating circumstances. There can be exonerating details. Diminished capacity could be a defense, that sort of thing. Under archaic codes of law, a broader range of acts is regulated by law, with severe punishments for deviance. What sociologists call mores predominate over folkways. So laws covering deviance and crime, morals covering deviance like sin or public offensiveness are under, kind of direct moral scrutiny. And there are fewer things which are just customs, which are just folkways, which are just lifestyles. Under a modern code of law, the realm of mores is much more severely restricted. The realm of folkways is much more expanded. Different strokes for different folks. You can have lifestyle differences, and this is effectively a definition of liberty, the breadth or the restriction of mores and folkways. Conversely, counting a broad range of acts or beliefs as crimes is what defines unfreedom. Think, for example, about North Korea. In December 2013, North Korea executed Jang Song-taek, there he is, second in power behind his nephew, Kim Jong-un. So nephew, uncle and nephew. Why? Because he didn't clap enthusiastically enough, Dear leader, yes. And if you don't do that, you may lose your life. More recently, an American student, Otto Warmbier, was arrested for putting up a poster, just a college prank, but he was sentenced to a very long sentence, and he died in prison, probably from maltreatment by the North Korean authorities. Law in Athens was more like North Korea and less like the United States. That's the point to make here. Socrates was prosecuted in a capital case for morals offenses, basically acts which don't rise to the level of crime in our world. In our world, there are certain elements of a crime, elements which must be met in order for an act to be a crime. First of all, it must be an act. There cannot be thought crimes. Secondly, the act must be specifically defined in the law and prohibited by law. There must be mens rea. There must be an informed intention to perform the prohibited act. And a crime cannot predate its prohibition. There are no ex post facto laws. For example, nowadays there's a controversy about abortion. There are people in this country who would like to make abortion a capital offense, or at least a major felony, either for the doctor who performs it or the woman who procures it. And who knows what will happen. Right now, abortion is legal under basically the umbrella right of a right to privacy, which is an old right in common law. There's a whole interesting story there. That may be changed by statute or constitutional amendment. That's what the anti-abortion forces would like to see. But let's say that abortion is criminalized, okay? Such a law, if passed in future, could not be retrojected backwards. That is, the authorities could not come after someone who had an abortion in 2020 and say, well, yeah, it wasn't illegal then, but it is illegal now, so you're being prosecuted. That sort of thing is completely disallowed in modern circumstances. So the modern restrictions are very, very, very stringent. Sharia law, by contrast, a highly non-restrictive view of crime, massacre those who insult Islam, behead those who insult Islam, showing disrespect for the Prophet, for example, can be not only a crime, but a capital crime. Have you heard of Salman Rushdie? Salman Rushdie is a good case in point. Salman Rushdie wrote a book called The Satanic Verses. It's a novel. It's a magical realist sort of novel. And in it, there's mention is made of Prophet Muhammad. Well, this was held to be blasphemy. He was tried in an Islamic court, and a fatwa was issued for his execution by the Ayatollah Khomeini. Basically, any faithful Muslim in any part of the world at any time, if they killed Salman Rushdie, would be carrying out a legal death sentence, would not be freelancing and committing murder. And he had to go undercover for years, could not show his face in public. MI5 guarded him. Eventually, the fatwa was lifted. This was kind of difficult because under Islamic law, only the cleric who actually issues the fatwa can rescind it, and the Ayatollah Khomeini had died in the meantime. They eventually got it lifted. So yeah, Salman Rushdie now can go out in public. He makes appearances, but you got to imagine for the rest of his life, he's looking over his shoulder, he's listening for the hoofbeats. But this is considered to be a legitimate exercise of law under the concept of Sharia. Athens also allowed a broader, much less restrictive concept of crime. According to the things for which Socrates was arrested and tried, just wouldn't arise in our system of law. Also, the set of procedures at the trial is different from our set of procedures. First of all, as I mentioned already, there's no public prosecutor. Charges are filed by one individual citizen against another, but there's a proviso. The person filing the charges has to get at least 20% of the vote to convict. If not, then he pays a fine of 1,000 drachma, which would be something like $60,000 in our money. So that's meant to act as a deterrent against frivolous prosecutions. You better at least have 20% of the jury on your side. You better be probable that's going to happen, or you better not. You better think twice about filing the charges. There are no defense lawyers. The accused defends himself. There are no lawyers or judges at all, and so there's no gavel. And you're going to hear this, you see this when we read the account of the trial, because Socrates is going to say from time to time, "Now, Athenians, settle down, be quiet. I have to have my day in court. You have to hear me out. Don't drown me out. Don't drown me out with your shouts." Sin is not distinguished from crime. Accusations are quite vague, as we'll see. One of the accusations against Socrates is not believing in the gods in which the city believes. And that's very unclear. Trial is by jury, as it is in our system, but in our system, the jury is 12 people. In the Athenian system, it's 500, maybe 501. And the rationale was that 500 people are harder to bribe. The distinction between city council and court judicial system, not quite as firm as ours is. We have separation of powers, but the people who are sitting in the jury are the people in the city council, basically. Each party has 3 hours to present its case. There's a water clock called hydroclepsia, which measures out the time, and when it's done, then your time is done. Other cities, not Athens, required capital cases that the trial lasts for more than 1 day. As we'll see in Socrates' case, it takes place in 1 day. Verdicts do not need to be unanimous as they do in our system. You need a simple majority. And basically what happens is the jurors are each issued 2 ballots. They're little physical discs like this. And as you file out of the courtroom, you vote by dropping the appropriate disc in the jury ballot box and throwing the other one away. And then they simply count. There's no appeal. There's a trial phase and a penalty phase. And in this particular kind of case that Socrates is being tried in, there are no fixed penalties. So what happens is the prosecution proposes a penalty, then the defense gets to propose a penalty, assuming the person is convicted, and then the jury votes again on that penalty. No appeals. If the sentence is death, normally the sentence is carried out forthwith that very same day. As we'll see in the case of Socrates, there were circumstances which prevented that from happening. So he will actually spend about a month or so in prison waiting for his execution before it actually happens. Oh, did I let the cat out of the bag? Yes, he's going to lose this trial. Okay, so let's look at the trial. Meletus was, I went backwards there, didn't I? Meletus, who was the main guy prosecuting Socrates, asking for the death penalty. What are the charges? There's a religious offense and a morals offense, 2 charges. Well, and he's asking for death. How many crimes should merit death? Xenophon, who also wrote an apology of Socrates, just like Plato did, it says in that writing the following. Now, of all the acts for which the laws have prescribed the death penalty, temple robbery, burglary, enslavement, treason to the state, not even my adversaries themselves charge me with having committed any of these, indeed. Seem fairly minor offenses, certainly by our way of looking at things, for a capital trial. Here's a good account if you want to follow it up, follow the link to the URL. And it has some key resources. Okay, now, we looked at the Agora before. There's a map of it on the left-hand side. The court in which Socrates was tried was the new court I mentioned a little earlier, the Heleia, the People's Court. And here is its location. This is what it looks like today. It was called the Heleia because it was an open-air court. Helios was the sun. It was a government, the original government in the Sunshine Act, if you will. Later, part of it was roofed over, but in Socrates' time, it was open air. And here is another view of it. Here, I'm standing on the very ground in which Socrates stood while he was on trial for his life. Socrates was prosecuted by Meletus, who was the mouthpiece and the front man, for a couple of other guys. Anytus, we heard of Anytus before. He was the guy who hosted General Meno during the dialogue between Socrates and Meno. And then there's a third guy by the name of Lycon. But Meletus is the main guy. How wonderful that you know what virtue is, and you're only 20 years old. A very young man with a slight beard, as Socrates said to Euthyphro at the Stoa Basileus. There is no formal charge sheet that survives, although one did for a while, and it was consulted by Diogenes Laertius, but it's disappeared since. All we have is what's said in the text of the Apology, which is that Socrates was being tried for 2 things: corrupting the youth, whatever that may mean, although I've suggested Alcibiades and Critias may be specifically behind that charge, specifically referred to in that charge. Also believing not in the gods whom the state believes in, but in other new divinities. So the first is a morals charge, the second is a religious offense. On cross-examination, as we'll see, Meletus actually accuses Socrates in open court of outright atheism. Socrates is going to deal with that in short order, as we'll see. And the last thing that needs to be said before we actually start the text is, why is this called the Apology? because, as we'll see, Socrates is very unrepentant for what he's being charged. Well, apology in our world means, basically saying I'm sorry, but more generally, and in this case, it means an explanation. So Socrates is giving an explanation. Plato calls his account of this the apology for Socrates. If you know about John Henry Newman, he wrote a book also called An Apology, Apologia Pro Vitis. John Henry Newman was an Anglican clergyman up at, I think it was Oriel College up at Oxford. In order to hold a fellowship in college, one had to be a member of the Anglican Communion, the Church of England, the official church, had to subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church as they were enforced at that time. That's kind of gone away in contemporary Anglican Church. But as he reads theology, he comes to the conclusion, Heath Newman comes to the conclusion that apostolic succession does not apply to the Anglican Communion, only applies to the Church of Rome. Apostolic succession basically means that the bishop has had had hands laid on him by the previous bishop to ordain him, who was ordained by the previous bishop. And then that laying on of hands goes all the way back to the apostles themselves. There's an apostolic succession to the present. And Newman comes to conclude that that was broken in the Anglican Communion. Well, for a Catholic communion, that's what makes a church either legitimate or not. So he concludes that the Anglican Communion is not, in fact, legitimate. He converts to Roman Catholicism, is ordained as a priest in that church, and then, of course, ends his fellowship at Oxford. Now, it ended happily for Newman in the sense that he later became not only a bishop but a cardinal. And when he's older, he writes this book, The Apology, to explain to the British public why he did what he did. It was a great scandal at the time. And so Newman is not saying, I'm sorry I became a Catholic, I repent of that. No, he's not saying that at all. Nor is Socrates saying, I'm sorry that I did what I did. But he is apologizing in this broader sense nonetheless. Okay, well, let's read. This is mostly, unlike the other two we've read so far, it's mostly a monologue, although he gets to cross-examine Meletus, so there's a bit of dialogue. Socrates begins in the following way. I do not know what impression my actions have made upon you, Athenians, but I do know that they nearly made me forget who I was, so persuasive were they. And yet they have scarcely spoken one word of truth. And my accusers, not saying accusations. They have scarcely spoken one word of truth. Of all their many falsehoods, the one which astonished me most was their saying that I was a clever speaker and that you must be careful not to let me deceive you. I thought that it was most shameless of them not to be ashamed to talk in that way. For as soon as I open my mouth, they will be refuted, and I shall prove that I am not a clever speaker in any way at all. Unless, indeed, by a clever speaker, they mean someone who speaks the truth. If that is their meaning, I agree with them, that I'm an orator not to be compared with them. My accusers, I repeat, have said little or nothing that is true, and from me you shall hear the whole truth. Certainly you will not hear a speech, Athenians, dressed up like theirs with fancy words and phrases. I will say to you what I have to say without artifice, and I shall use the first words which come to mind. For I believe that what I have to say is just. So let none of you expect anything else. Indeed, my friends, it would hardly be right for me at my age to come before you like a schoolboy with his concocted phrases. But there is one thing, Athenians, which I do most earnestly beg and entreat of you. Do not be surprised and do not interrupt with shouts if in my defense I speak in the same way that I'm accustomed to speak in the marketplace, at the tables of the money changers, where many of you have heard me, and elsewhere. The truth is this. I am more than 70, and this is the first time that I've ever come before a law court. Thus, your manner of speech here is quite strange to me. If I had really been a stranger, you would have forgiven me for speaking in the language and manner of my native country. And so now I ask you to grant me what I think I have the right to claim. Never mind the matter of my speech. It may be superior, it may be inferior to the usual manner. Give your whole attention to the question whether what I say is just or not. That is what is required of a good judge, as speaking the truth is required of a good orator. So Socrates starts out playing the all shucks card. You know, I'm an old man, just old socks here, and I've been jawing with you like I've been talking when I'm out shopping. I ain't going to do no highfalutin speechifying. This was a typical sort of opening gambit called the prooimion in court, and Socrates leads with that. And now he turns to some of the accusations, starting with the easy bits first. Oh, by the way, I should have mentioned we started on page 33 of Mr. Corman's second edition. Now we're on 34. first new paragraph in the first column. I have to defend myself, Athenians, first against the older false accusations of my old accusers, and then against the more recent ones of my present accusers. For many men have been accusing me to you, and for very many years, who have not spoken a word of truth. And I fear them more than I fear Anaxagoras and his associates, formidable as they may be. But, my friends, the others are still more formidable, since they got hold of most of you when you were children, and have been more persistent in accusing me untruthfully, persuading you that there is a certain Socrates, a wise man, who speculates about the heavens, who investigate things that are beneath the earth, and who can make the worse argument appear the stronger. These men, Athenians, who spread abroad this report, are the accusers whom I fear, for their hearers think that persons who pursue such inquiries never believe in the gods. Besides, they are many, and their attacks have been going on for a long time, and they spoke to you when you were most ready to believe them, since you were all young and some of you were children. And there was no one to answer them when they attacked me. The most preposterous thing of all is that I do not even know their names. I cannot tell you who they are, except one happens to be a comic poet. But all the rest who have persuaded you from motives of resentment and prejudice, and sometimes it may be from conviction, are hardest to cope with. For I cannot call any one of them forward in court to cross-examine him. I have, as it were, simply to spar with shadows in my defense, and to put questions which there is no one to answer. I ask you, therefore, to believe that, as I say, I have been attacked by two kinds of accusers. First, by Meletus and his associates, and then by the older ones of whom I have spoken. And with your leave, I will defend myself first against my old accusers, since you have heard their accusations first, and they were much more compelling than my present ones are. Well, I must make my defense, Athenians, and try, in the short time allowed me, to remove the prejudice which you have been so long a time acquiring. I hope that I may manage to do this if it be best for you and me, and that my defense may be successful, but I am quite aware of the nature of my task, and I know that it is a difficult one. Be the outcome, however, as is pleasing to God, I must obey the law and make my defense. Let us begin from the beginning, then, and ask what is the accusation that has given rise to the prejudice against me, on which Meletus relied when he brought his indictment. What is the prejudice which my enemies have been spreading about me? I must assume that they are formally accusing me and read their indictment. It would run somewhat in this fashion. Socrates is guilty of engaging in inquiries into things beneath the earth and in the heavens, and of making the weaker argument appear the stronger, and of teaching these same things. That is what they say. And in the comedy of Aristophanes, you yourselves saw a man called Socrates swinging around in a basket and saying that he walked on air and sputtering a great deal of nonsense about matters in which I understand nothing at all. I do not mean to disparage that kind of knowledge if there is anyone who is wise about these matters. I trust Meletus will never be able to prosecute me for that. But the truth is, Athenians, I have nothing to do with these matters, and almost all of you yourselves are my witnesses of this. I beg all of you who have ever heard me discussing, and there are many, to inform your neighbors and tell them if any of you have ever heard me discussing such matters at all. That will show you that the other common statements about me are as false as this one. So Socrates refers here to a well-known account. Aristophanes, the playwright, wrote a play called The Clouds. There was a character in that play named, guess what? Socrates. And he ran a school called the Thoughteree, or the Thinkery, sometimes it's translated. He did this in some other plays as well. And the stagecraft was the character Socrates would be hauled across the stage on a pulley, as if he were walking on air and spouting all kinds of stuff about the heavens and the earth and so on and so forth. And Socrates was probably in the audience and probably laughed along with everyone else. It was a comic deal, but perhaps some people took it as a serious portrait of the actual person, Socrates. But he continues, the fact is that not one of these is true. And if you have heard that I undertake to educate men and make money by doing so, that is not true either. Though I think it would be a fine thing to be able to educate men, as Socrates of Leontini and Prodicus of Chios and Hippias of Elis do. For each of them, my friends can go into any city and persuade the young men to leave the society of their fellow citizens with any of whom they might associate for nothing, and be only too glad to be allowed to pay money for the privilege of associating with themselves. And I believe there's another wise man from Paros residing in Athens at this moment. I happen to mean happened to meet Callias, the son of Hipponicus, a man who has spent more money on sophists than anyone else put together. So I said to him, he has two sons, Callias, if your two sons had been foals or calves, we could have hired a trainer for them who would have trained them to excel in doing what they are naturally capable of. He would have been either a groom or a farmer. But whom do you intend to train them, seeing that they are men? Who understands the excellence which a citizen and a man is capable of attaining? I suppose you must have thought of this because you have sons. Is there such a person or not? Certainly there is, he replied. Who is he, I said. Where does he come from? What is his fee? Eminence, Socrates, he replied, from Paris, 5 minae. Minae was a monetary unit. Then I thought that Eminence was a fortunate person if he really understood this art and could teach so cleverly. If I had possessed knowledge of this kind, I should have been conceited and disdainful. But, Athenians, the truth is, I do not possess it. Perhaps some of you may reply, but Socrates, what's the trouble with you? What has given rise to these prejudices against you? You must have been doing something out of the ordinary. All these rumors and reports of you would never have arisen if you had not been doing something different from other men. Where there's smoke, there's fire, basically. So tell us what it is, that we may not give our verdict arbitrarily. I think that is a fair question, and I will try to explain to you what it is that has raised these prejudices against me and given me this reputation. Listen then. Some of you perhaps will think I'm joking, but I assure you that I will tell you the whole truth. I have gained this reputation, Athenians, simply by reason of a certain wisdom. But by what kind of wisdom? It is by just that wisdom which is perhaps human wisdom. In that, it may be I am really wise, but the men of whom I was speaking just now must be wise in a wisdom which is greater than human wisdom, or else I cannot describe it, for certainly I know nothing of it myself. And if any man says that I do, he lies and speaks to arouse prejudice against me. Do not interrupt me with shouts, Athenians, even if you think that I am boasting. Again, there's no judge to gavel him down. What I'm going to say to you is not my own statement. I will tell you who says it, and he is worthy of your respect. You remember Hierophon? From youth upwards, he was my comrade and also a partisan of your democracy, sharing your recent exile and returning with you. You remember, too, Hierophon's character, how impulsive he was in carrying through whatever he took in hand. Once he went to Delphi and ventured to put this question to the oracle. I entreat you again, my friends, not to interrupt me with your shouts. He asked if there was anyone who was wiser than I. The priestess answered that there was no one. Hierophon himself is dead, but his brother here will witness to what I say. Now see why I tell you this. I'm going to explain to you how the prejudice against me has arisen. When I heard the oracle, I began to reflect. What can the god mean by this riddle? I know very well that I am not wise, even in the smallest degree. Then what can he mean by saying that I am the wisest of all men? It cannot be that he is speaking falsely, for he is a god and cannot lie. The priestess was now, as you recall, in the service of the god Apollo. That's what he's talking about here. For a long time, I was at a loss to understand his meaning. Then, very reluctantly, I turned to investigate it in this manner. I went to a man who was reputed to be wise, thinking that there, if anywhere, I should prove the answer wrong, and meaning to point out to the oracle its mistake, and to say, you said that I was the wisest of men, but this man is wiser than I am. So I examined the man. I need not tell you his name. He was a politician, but this was the result, Athenians. When I conversed with him, I came to see that, though a great many persons, and most of all he himself, thought that he was wise, yet he was not wise. Then I tried to prove to him that he was not wise, although he fancied that he was. By so doing, I made him indignant in many of the bystanders. So, when I went away, I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. Neither of us knows anything that is really worth knowing, but he thinks that he has knowledge when he has not, while I, having no knowledge, do not think that I have. I seem at any rate to be a little wiser than he is on this point. I do not think that I know what I do not know. Again, why is Socrates the wisest man in all Greece? Next, I went to another man who was reputed to be still wiser than the last with exactly the same result. And there again, I made him and many other men indignant. Then I went on to one man after another, realizing that I was arousing indignation every day, which caused me much pain and anxiety. Still, I thought that I must set the god's command above everything else. So I had to go to every man who seemed to possess any knowledge and investigate the meaning of the oracle. Athenians, I must tell you the truth. I swear, this was the result of the investigation which I made at the gods' command. I found that the men whose reputation for wisdom stood highest were nearly the most lacking in it, while others who were looked down as common people were much more intelligent. Now I must describe to you the wanderings which I undertook like Herculean labors to prove the oracle irrefutable. After the politicians, I went to the poets, tragic, dithyrambic, and others, thinking that there I should find myself manifestly more ignorant than they. So I took up the poems on which I thought they had spent the most pains and asked them what they meant, hoping at the same time to learn something from them. I'm ashamed to tell you the truth, my friends, but I must say it. Almost any one of the bystanders could have talked about the works of these poets better than the poets themselves. So I soon found that it is not by wisdom that the poets create their works, but by a certain instinctive inspiration, like soothsayers and prophets, who say many fine things but understand nothing of what they say. The poets seem to me to be in a similar situation. And at the same time, I perceived that because of their poetry, they thought that they were the wisest of men in other matters too, which they were not. So I went away again thinking that I had the same advantage over the poets that I had over the politicians. Finally, I went to the artisans. For I knew very well that I possessed no knowledge at all worth speaking of, and I was sure that I should find that they knew many fine things. And in that I was not mistaken. They knew what I did not know, and so far they were wiser than I. But, Athenians, it seems to me that the skilled artisans had the same failing as the poets. Each of them believed himself to be extremely wise in matters of the greatest importance because he was skillful in his own art, and this presumption of theirs obscured their real wisdom. So I asked myself, on behalf of the oracle, whether I would choose to remain as I was without either their wisdom or their ignorance, or to possess both as they did. And I answered to myself and to the oracle that it was better for me to remain as I was. Okay, we've kind of gone through a lot of stuff here. Let me just kind of catch up. There's talk about the sophists here. Socrates talks about his friend hiring a sophist. The word sophist comes from the word Sophia, which means wisdom. It referred to a group of itinerant teachers. These were mainly foreigners who did what Socrates describes basically. They claimed they could teach arete, remember arete, virtue from the Meno dialogue, to students by teaching philosophy or rhetoric and doing so for a fee. And those fees differed. Some of them could be quite expensive. Some of them could be fairly cheap. Emily Wilson, the most famous sophists like Pythagoras or Gorgias, could charge around 100 mina for a complete course of study. This was roughly equivalent to $500,000, more than the current cost of a bachelor's degree from Harvard or Yale, which is about $350,000. That's a staggering figure, by the way. Less famous teachers could be hired for a much lower fee. Evenus of Paros, this is the one Socrates mentions, charged only 5 mina for a whole course. So fees did vary. Socrates, of course, makes a point of not charging any fee, and his explanation for that is, I don't have anything to sell. I can't teach. There is no such teaching, remember. There's only learning. Learning is only remembrance. I'm not going to, for whatever reason, I'm not going to do it for money. Do we have sophists today who attempt to sell success? Often the sophists caught the same flack that Socrates does for impious investigations into earth and heaven, etc. Making the better cause appear the stronger was a charge often leveled against them. As I mentioned before, there were no lawyers and democracy was direct, so it was an important skill for these free, rich young men who formed the citizenry of Athens to be able to make a persuasive speech in the assembly and a persuasive speech in defense in court, if necessary. So the arts of rhetoric in particular were highly valued. And, if you are acting as a lawyer or a legislator, those of you who may go on to law school will find this, you need to be able to argue both sides of a case. In fact, that's a practice exercise that law students do. Here, you defend Osama bin Laden and put on the best defense you can for him. Well, you may not believe in Osama bin Laden's innocence, but if you're a lawyer, you've got to defend your client as if they were innocent, no matter what you think. So this is a kind of art that was in demand in their world as it is for some sectors of ours as well. And there were plenty of people around willing to deliver, or at least claim that they could deliver. We have such people today. Warren Buffett will tell you 10 ways to get rich. Warren Buffett's secrets can work for you if you pay him a fee in a seminar. Well, but then they're not secrets anymore, are they? Rewire your brain for success. Susie Orman, the dominatrix of money, 9 steps to financial freedom. And you watch her, and she's got this audience of hundreds of people, and they're all, a lot of them look like retirees, just, wide-eyed. She's going to tell them, if they just do 9 things in succession, then their ship's going to come in, they're going to be rich, really. And then there was this Trump University. We teach success. Hey, how's that working out now? By the way, here's why I'm not rich. I'm not a crook. I don't have rich relatives. I'm not a gold digger or kept sex toy. I don't need a 4th reason, because those 3 pretty much explain how rich people got to be rich. Now, the question of marginal differentiation comes up with the sophists, and particularly with respect to Socrates being accused of being a sophist. Marginal differentiation refers to the way in advertising, you want to sell your product as opposed to the other guy's product. So you focus on things that are different and unique about your product, even if they're not unique, even if they're only marginally so. So, doctors prefer to smoke Luckies. Well, doctors smoke lots of different cigarettes. Lucky, it's toasted. Well, yeah, all tobacco is toasted, but that kind of makes Lucky stand out for true or for false. Marginal differentiation, it's called. And we can ask the question about Socrates, is he just engaging in marginal differentiation here when he is distinguishing himself from the sophists? There's a case to be made for and against. Suppose we begin by thinking about what Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are doing as midway between what goes on in a university as we know it, what goes on in one of these fee-based motivational seminars the contemporary sophists truck in. So they're kind of somewhere there in the middle. Now, Aristotle and Plato first, then Aristotle, founded formal schools. Aristotle was basically, as Bertrand Russell says, the first professor. But even if Aristotle was the first professor, Plato before him had pioneered some of the same techniques we recognize in universities today. Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, interesting book, Plato at the Googleplex. She's a very, very interesting figure in general, well worth reading, but Plato at the Googleplex in particular. She says this: Plato could stroll today into almost any graduate seminar in philosophy. He could catch the drift in no time at all. They're basically doing what he was doing all along. First off, Plato would have little trouble recognizing the techniques being employed. The laborious constructions and deconstructions of arguments, the intense inspection of intuitions, drawing out their implications and prodding and palpating them for their contradictions and other unwelcome consequences. The counterexample tossed in the face of proposed generalizations. Remember the dreaded counterexample? The endless attempts to get a grip on slippery terms, to separate out multiple senses that get merged under single expressions, and so on and so forth. So Aristotle, the first professor, Plato, who really kind of founded the seminar, they kind of resemble what we do today in universities. Socrates, says Neuberger-Goldstein, was a kind of a busker. He's like the guy who plays music in the street with the cup for his change, except he doesn't have a cup for change. And by the way, nothing against buskers. Buskers can be very good musicians. I've stopped and listened to people in Central Park and Washington Square who I'd pay money to hear, in a club. But they're just doing it for whoever wants to hear and doing it for free, unless you want to give them a little, recompense. The man, says Neuberger-Goldstein, who wandered barefoot to the Athenian agora in a not terribly clean chiton. They didn't wear togas, they wore chitons, what they wore, the sheet basically. A busker of dialectics, that was Socrates. I remember him teaching the little boy. He's just drawing diagrams in the dirt with a stick. If you studied with Socrates, you just bumped into him. You walked along and talked as long as you could tolerate it. Remember Simon the shoemaker's shop. You go to the shoemaker's shop and catch Socrates, or maybe get on a local pub and have a pint, hopefully not a green pint that he's got. in his hand there. So Socrates was, unlike Plato and Aristotle, not exactly your modern day teacher in the school sense. This is an old Estelle assessment. This is the old personnel evaluation form used by LA Unified up to about maybe 10 years ago. It was 2 pages front and back, as you can see here. The current one is a book. Don't be going into that, but if Socrates were given a teaching evaluation in the modern form, he would fail. Rambles from one topic to another, reduces student self-esteem by his constant demonstration that they are ignorant of even basic concepts. No lesson plans evident, draws geometric figures in the dirt with a stick, never to be found in his assigned classroom, teaches only when he wants, dresses in old sheets, occasionally goes into a trance, gives no grades, wastes time taking students to wander in the market, teaches in a language other than English. Currently on trial for capital crime, reputed atheist, reputed corrupter of the city's youth, recommendation, hemlock. So in respect of being itinerant and not schoolbound, Socrates as a teacher was more like the sophists, less like Plato, Aristotle, or any other professor we would recognize today. So somewhere there in the middle. As Emily Wilson notes, the sophists were foreigners. There are a number of them. Socrates was not a foreigner. He was a native-born Athenian, but part of the prejudice against the sophists may be anti-immigrant prejudice that may rub off also on Socrates, despite. But despite his itinerancy, despite his lack of professorial presentation, despite his informality, despite his claim that there is neither teaching nor really learning except remembrance, there are several important ways in which Socrates is unlike the sophists. First of all, the sophists claim to deliver a product called education, and Socrates says, I can't give you anything. And they charge a fee. Socrates says, I don't charge any money. But he certainly was a character. Is there any such thing as bad publicity? Aristophanes, the same one who wrote the play about Socrates the Clouds, in the Clouds actually, says this. Hail, gray-headed hunter of phrases artistic. Hail, Socrates, master of twaddle. Out of all the specialists cosmologistic, we love for the brains in this noddle. Only Prodicus, we admire nonetheless for the way you swagger and cuss, and never wear shoes, and don't care how you dress, and solemnly discourse of us. So somebody, Socrates says in his defense, somebody says, where there's smoke, there's fire. Why is this prejudice arisen against you? And then Socrates tells the story of Hierophon and the Delphic oracle and what he did to test the oracle. I went to the politicians, then I went to the poets, then I went to the artisans, and I found none of them were what they were cracked up to be. This is a clever little rhetorical device because Socrates has 3 accusers. One of them was a politician, one was the son of a poet, and the other was an artisan, was a tanner. And so he's, subtly getting a dig in at these 3 accusers without directly naming them. But I think Socrates has a point, about people who think that they're wise in broad matters when at best they may be skilled in a limited field. And if they stuck to, Shoemaker stuck to his last, he'd be okay. But give him a Nobel Prize and he goes crazy. Indeed, Nobel Prize winners are often like this, Well, Dr. Einstein, what do you think about world peace? Well, maybe Albert Einstein knows something about world peace, but he certainly knows something about physics. Ask him a question about that. A guy named Kary Mullis won a Nobel Prize in 1993 for chemistry, did some legitimately good research, obviously, to do that. But then he's on the lecture circuit telling all kinds of people all kinds of things. There's very good evidence that astrology is real. All the real climatologists have been replaced by those guys that write global circulatory models, climatologists. It's not even probable, let alone scientifically proven, that HIV causes AIDS. Science, as it is practiced today in the world, is probably very similar to what was called science in 1634. No, and no. But he gets what some people have called the halo effect based on his Nobel Prize. People are willing to credit what he says in any field, even if he doesn't know really what he's talking about. And then Socrates goes on to draw the larger conclusion. So I asked myself on behalf of the oracle whether I would choose to remain as I was without either their wisdom or their ignorance, or to possess both as they did. And I answered to myself and to the oracle, it was better for me to remain as I was. Okay, and the oracle, of course, is the Delphic oracle. We've talked about that before. Then Socrates continues. Now we're at the bottom of about 2/3 down the second column on page 36. From this examination, Athenians, has arisen much fiercer and bitter indignation. And as a result, a great many prejudices against me, about me. People say that I am, quote, a wise man, unquote. For the bystanders always think that I am wise myself in any matter wherein I refute another. But, gentlemen, I believe that the God is really wise, and that by this oracle, he meant that the human wisdom is worth little or nothing. I do not think he meant that Socrates was wise. He only made use of my name and took me as an example, as though he were to say to men, he among you is wisest, who, like Socrates, knows that his wisdom is really worth nothing at all. Therefore, I still go about testing and examining every man whom I think wise, whether he be a citizen or a stranger, as the God has commanded me. I'm doing God's work. Whenever I find that he is not wise, I point out to him on the God's behalf that he is not wise. I am so busy in this pursuit that I have never had leisure to take any part worth mentioning in public matters or to look after my private affairs. I am in great poverty as a result of my service to the God. Besides this, there are the young men who follow me about, who are sons of wealthy persons who have most leisure, take pleasure in hearing men cross-examined. They often imitate me among themselves. Then they try their hands at cross-examining other people. And I imagine they find plenty of men who know little or nothing, or who think, that they know a great deal when in fact they know little or nothing. Then the persons who are cross-examined get angry with me instead of with themselves and say that Socrates is an abomination and corrupts the young. When they are asked why, what does he do? What does he teach? They do not know what to say. Not to seem at a loss, they repeat the stock charges against all philosophers and allege that he investigates things in the air and under the earth, and that he teaches people to disbelieve in the gods, or to make the worse argument appear the stronger. For I suppose they would not like to confess the truth, which is that they are shown up as ignorant pretenders to knowledge they do not possess. So they've been filling your ears with their bitter prejudices for a long time. For they are ambitious, energetic, and numerous. They speak vigorously and persuasively against me. Relying on this, Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon have attacked me. Meletus is indignant with me on behalf of the poets, Anytus on behalf of the artisans and politicians, and Lycon on behalf of the orators. And so, as I said at the beginning, I should be surprised if I am able, in the short time allowed me for my defense, to remove from your minds this prejudice which has grown so strong. What I have told you, Athenians, is the truth. I neither conceal nor do I suppress anything trivial or important. Yet I know that it is just this outspokenness which arouses indignation. But that is only a proof that my words are true, and that the prejudices against me and the causes of it are what I have said. And whether you investigate them now or hereafter, you will find that they are so. What I have said must suffice as my defense against the charges of my first accusers. I will try next to defend myself against Meletus, that good patriot, as he calls himself. The name Meletus actually means he who cares. We'll come back to that. And my later accusers. Let us assume that they are a new set of accusers and read their indictment as we did in the case of the others. It runs thus. Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and of believing not in the gods whom the state believes in, but in other new divinities. Such is the accusation. Let us examine each point in it separately. Meletus says that I am guilty of playing a solemn joke by casually bringing men to trial and pretending to have a solemn interest in matters to which he has never given a moment's thought. Now I will try to prove to you that this is so. Come here, Meletus. Is it not a fact that you think it very important that the young should be as good as possible? Meletus answers, it is. Come then, tell the judges who improves them. You care so much, that was his name. You must know. You are accusing me and bringing me to trial because, as you say, you have discovered that I am the corrupter of youth. Come now, reveal to the gentleman who improves them. You see, Meletus, you have nothing to say. You are silent. But don't you think this is shameful? Is not your silence a conclusive proof of what I say, that you have never cared? Come now, tell us, my good man, who makes the young better? The laws. That, my friend, is not my question. What man improves the young who begins by knowing the laws? The judges here, Socrates. What do you mean, Meletus? Can they educate the young and improve them? Certainly. All of them, or only some of them? All of them. By Hera, that is good news. Such a large supply of benefactors. And do the members of the audience here improve them or not? They do. And do the counselors? Yes. Well then, Meletus, do the members of the assembly corrupt the young, or do they again all improve them? They too improve them. Then all the Athenians apparently make the young good men except me, and I alone corrupt them? Is that your meaning? Certainly, that is my meaning. You have discovered me to be most unfortunate. Now tell me, do you think that the same holds good in the case of horses? Does one man do harm to them and everyone else improve them? On the contrary, it is not one man only or very few. Is it not one man only or very few, namely those who are skilled with horses, who can improve them, while the majority of men harm them if they use them and have anything to do with them? Is it not so, Meletus? Both with horses and with every other animal? Of course it is. And whether you or Anytus say yes or no, the young would certainly be very fortunate if only one man corrupted them and everyone else did them good. The truth is, Meletus, you prove conclusively that you have never thought about the young in your life. You exhibit your carelessness in not caring for the very matters about which you are prosecuting me, the man who cares, in other words. Now be so good as to tell us, Meletus, is it better to live among good citizens or bad ones? Answer, my friend, I'm not asking you at all a difficult question. Do not the bad harm their associates, and the good do them good? Yes. Is there anyone who would rather be injured than benefited by his companions? Answer, my good man. You are obliged by the law to answer. Does anyone like to be injured? Certainly not. Well then, are you prosecuting me for corrupting the young and making them worse, voluntarily or involuntarily? Oh, for doing it voluntarily. What, Meletus? Do you mean to say that you, who are so much younger than I, are yet so much wiser than I that you know bad citizens always do evil and that good citizens do good to those with whom they come in contact, while I am so extraordinarily ignorant as not to know that if I make any of my companions evil, he will probably injure me in some way? And you allege I do this voluntarily? You will not make me believe that, nor anyone else either, I should think. Either I do not corrupt the young at all, or if I do so involuntarily, so that you are lying in either case. And if I corrupt them involuntarily, the law does not call upon you to prosecute me for an error which is involuntary, but to take me aside privately and reprove and educate me. For of course I shall cease from doing wrong involuntarily as soon as I know that I have been doing wrong. We never knowingly do evil, says Socrates. But you avoid associating with me and educating me. Instead, you bring me up before the court, where the law sends persons not for education, but for punishment. Okay, so Meletus here under cross-examination, the man whose name means he who cares, the good patriot, doesn't seem to care all that much about his topic. He goes first for the point about corrupting the youth. And he does something somewhat undiplomatic here, because in using the analogy to the horses, he's really making an aristocratic point before a democratic jury. It's only the few who make horses better. You know, you say that only I make people bad and the many make them good, but really in every other aspect of life, horsemanship, for example, it's not the many that make people good, it's only a few. Am I doing it voluntarily or involuntarily? Voluntarily, well, you know, who would do that? That's stupid. And this goes back to the Meno dialogue, something like Socrates said there about good and evil. You know, surely I would know if I make people corrupt, they're going to injure me. You figured this out and I haven't yet. So if I corrupt the young, how do I do it? He continues. The truth is, Athenians, it's quite clear that Meletus has never cared at all about these matters. However, now tell us, Meletus, how do you say that I corrupt the young? Clearly, according to your indictment, by teaching them not to believe in the gods the state believes in, but other new divinities instead. You mean that I corrupt the young by that teaching, do you not? Yes, most certainly I mean that. Then, in the name of these gods of whom we are speaking, Explain yourself a little more clearly to me and to these gentlemen here. I cannot understand what you mean. Do you mean that I teach the young to believe in some gods, but not in the gods of the state? Do you accuse me of teaching them to believe in strange gods? If that is your meaning, I myself believe in some gods, and my crime is not that of complete atheism. Or do you mean that I do not believe in the gods at all myself, and that I teach other people not to believe in them either? I mean that you do not believe in the gods in any way whatever. You amaze me, Meletus. Why do you say that? Do you mean that I believe neither the sun nor the moon to be gods, like other men? I swear he does not judge us. He says the sun is a stone and the moon earth. My dear Meletus, do you think you're prosecuting Anaxagoras? You must have a very poor opinion of these men and think them illiterate if you imagine that they do not know that the works of Anaxagoras of Clazomenae are full of these doctrines. And so young men learn these things from me when they can often buy them in the theater for a drachma at most, and laugh at Socrates' word and pretend that these were his doctrines, which are very peculiar doctrines too, that they were his own. But please tell me, do you really think I do not believe in the gods at all? Most certainly I do. You are a complete atheist. No one believes that, Meletus, not even you yourself. It seems to me, Athenians, that Meletus is very insolent and reckless, and that he is prosecuting me simply out of insolence, recklessness, and youthful bravado. For he seems to be testing me by asking me a riddle which has no answer. Will this wise Socrates, he says to himself, see that I am joking and contradicting myself, or shall I deceive him and everyone else who hears me? Meletus seems to me to contradict himself in his indictment. It is as if he were to say, Socrates is guilty of not believing in the gods, but believes in the gods. This is joking. Now, my friends, let us see why I think that is his meaning. You must answer me, Meletus, and you Athenians must remember the request I made from you at the start, and not interrupt me with these shouts if I talk in my usual manner. Is there any man, Meletus, who believes in the existence of things pertaining to men and not in the existence of men? Make him answer the question, gentlemen, without these interruptions. Is there any man who believes in the existence of horsemanship and not in the existence of horses, or in flute playing and not in flute players? There is not, my friend. If you will not answer, I will tell both you and the judges. But you must answer my next question. Is there any man who believes in the existence of divine things and not in the existence of divinities? There is not. Well, I'm very glad that these gentlemen have managed to extract an answer from you. Well then, you say that I believe in divine things, whether they be old or new, and that I teach others to believe in them. At any rate, according to your statement, I believe in divine things. That you have sworn in your indictment. But if I believe in divine things, I suppose it follows necessarily that I believe in divinities. Is that not so? It is. I assume that you grant that, as you do not answer. But we do not believe that do we not believe that divinities are either gods themselves or the children of gods? Do you admit that? I do. Then you admit that I believe in divinities. Now, if these divinities are gods, then, as I say, you are joking and asking a riddle and asserting that I do not believe in the gods, and at the same time that I do, since I believe in divinities. But if these divinities are the illegitimate children of the gods, either by nymphs or other mothers, as they're said to be, then I ask, what man could believe in the existence of the children of the gods and not in the existence of the gods? That would be as absurd in believing in the existence of the offspring of horses and asses and not the existence of horses and asses. You must have indicted me in this manner, Meletus, either to test me because you could not find any act of injustice or because you could not find any act of injustice that you would accuse me of with truth. But you will never contrive to persuade any man with any sense at all that a belief in divine things and things of the gods does not necessarily involve a belief in divinities and in the gods. So, just to catch up here, we've already talked about Anaxagoras and his problems with the Athenian courts sometime decades before. Basically, clearly, Meletus is confounding Socrates with all the other reports of various other philosophers that he's heard, including Anaxagoras and the sophists and so forth. Now, at some point, we're not obligated to continue a conversation. In democracy, everybody has right to their opinions. Opinions are like noses, right? Everybody has one. In the academy, though, you have to earn the right to your opinion. You can't just assert anything you please without being able to back it up. So, you know, and we need both. Viva Wikipedia, but also viva peer review. But, you know, Socrates at this point would be quite justified in saying to Meletus, you know, goodbye, Phil, have a piece of lettuce. Nice talking to you. But he doesn't. He presses it home. Do you think I don't believe in the gods at all? You're a complete atheist. And I think I asked this question before. True or false, all philosophers are atheists. Well, that's not true. Some of them are not. So it's not enough to assume, as Meletus seems to do, that just because someone is a philosopher, he must disbelieve in all of the gods. This is particularly so in the case of Socrates, who as a Greek is prepared to believe in a number of gods, including he even says that the sun is a god and so forth. The Greeks had many gods. And of course, we talked about this before earlier in introducing Socrates and Euthyphro. There were multiple layers of Greek religion, 5 stages of Greek religion, as Gilbert Murray says. Everybody had their family ancestral cult, in addition to the chthonics gods, the Titans, the Olympians, if they worshipped some of the new gods as Socrates did. And Socrates, of course, had his own personal god, his daimonion. So Socrates is not lacking for God. So Meletus accuses him of atheism. Socrates pretty much disposes of that charge, as we've seen. But is there anything else at work here? Maybe. I.F. Stone, interesting character. He was a muckraking journalist, not a university man, but he got interested in the trial of Socrates, taught himself Greek so he could read the original texts, and wrote a book on the trial of Socrates, still well worth reading, still in print, respected by classicists, and they can be, you know, kind of a protective lot. But I.F. Stone says he was perhaps behind the between the lines, being persecuted for not believing in some of the gods that were especially popular among the Athenians, particularly the working class, particularly Hephaestus, Zeus Agoraios, and Phaedo. We've already talked about Hephaestus, remember, when we talked about the Agora, and that big temple that's still in pretty good shape, dominating the Agora. This was the temple of Hephaestus, who was the god of the forge, popular with the working class. There was Zeus Agoraios, the Zeus of the marketplace, basically. And then there was Phaedo, the goddess of persuasion. And you could read Stone's argument here. He thinks that it's between the lines, Socrates was being prosecuted for not paying sufficient attention to those particular popular gods. And then he, you know, Socrates keeps Meletus on the ropes. You say, I believe in divinities, but I don't believe in gods. Well, does anyone believe in human things but not human beings, horsemanship but not horses, flute playing but not flute players? Of course not. Just as the mule is an offspring of a horse or an ass, if you believe in mules, you must believe also that there are such things as horses and asses. Well, it's pretty much, you know, Meletus is pretty much over at this point. He who cares clearly doesn't care. But why is Meletus, and Socrates, you know, refers to the age difference, and why is this young man willing to put a 70-year-old philosopher on trial for his very life? And here's an annoying question. If this was a problem with Socrates, it was a problem with Socrates all his life, why was he just prosecuted at the very end of his life? Was this a frivolous prosecution? And the Athenians, as I said, did worry about that. That's why they had that fine for people who didn't get the 20%. Okay, his defense isn't over, but he's pretty much finished with Meletus. But let's go on and see where he goes next. But in truth, Athenians, I do not think that I need to say very much to prove to you I have not committed the act of injustice for which Meletus is prosecuting me. What I have said is enough to prove that. But be assured, it is certainly true, as I've already told you, that I have aroused much indignation. That is what will cause my condemnation if I am condemned. Not Meletus, nor Anaxagoras either, but the prejudice and resentment of the multitude, again, not a very diplomatic thing to say, to a group of to supporters of the democracy, the many, the hoi polloi, the prejudice and resentment of the multitude, which have been the destruction of so many good people before me, and I think will be so again. There is no prospect that I shall be the last victim. Perhaps someone will say, are you not ashamed, Socrates, of leading a life which is very likely now to cause your death? I should answer him with justice and say, my friend, if you think a man of any worth at all ought to reckon the chances of life and death when he acts, or they ought to think of anything but whether he is acting justly or unjustly, and as a good man or bad man would act, you are mistaken. According to you, the demigods who died at Troy would be foolish, and among them Achilles, who thought nothing of danger even when the alternative was disgrace. For when his mother, and she was a goddess, addressed him when he was resolved to slay Hector in this fashion, my son, if you avenge the death of your comrade Patroclus and slay Hector, you will die yourself, for fate awaits you next after Hector. When he heard this, he scorned danger and death. He feared much more to live a coward and not to avenge his friend. Let me punish the evildoer and afterwards die, he said, that I may not remain here by the beaked ships jeered at, encumbering the earth. Do you suppose that he thought of danger or of death? For this, Athenians, I believe to be the truth. Whatever a man's station is, whether he has chosen it of his own will or whether he has been placed at it by his commander, there it is his duty to remain and face the danger without thinking of death or any other thing except disgrace. Okay, so Socrates has gotten started. He's played the shucks card. He's tried to get rid of Aristophanes, the older accusers. He's completely demolished Meletus on the witness stand. And now he's going to play the warrior's card. Are you not ashamed, Socrates, of leading a life which might lead to your death? Bring it. Death before dishonor. Socrates was an Athenian jarhead. The technical term in his day was hoplite. The hoplite, as we'll see, was a kind of Greek warrior, very, very sensitive to the Greek style of warfare. If you watch NCIS, Special Agent Gibbs, somebody refers to a guy as an ex-Marine, and Gibbs is going to correct them. Once a Marine, always a Marine. Well, it's like that here. Once a hoplite, always a hoplite. Hoorah. Here is the first depiction of hoplite warriors. They're called hoplites from the hopla, the round shield that they carried. And as we've seen, they, had all kinds of decorations on their shields. The Spartans had their letter L, but the Athenians were a little more creative with theirs. Now, if you've seen the movie Troy, you've seen what warfare was like in Homeric times before, long before this. Achilles goes after his enemies one at a time with his spear or his sword, mostly his spear. And it's a one-on-one sort of fight, freestyle. But hoplite warfare was disciplined and standardized. They fought in the phalanxes, as it was called, and they adopted this tactic because it was a way of defeating their new enemy, the Persians, particularly when the Persians were outnumbering them. The hoplites were infantry. They fought up close and hand-to-hand, but they fought in disciplined order. Here is a later Macedonian phalanx. 8 ranks deep of men was the typical size then. It was maybe fewer in Socrates' time, although there's a mention of 7 ranks deep at one point. And basically what the soldiers would do was they would lock shields, kind of like a Roman testudo, put spears forward, okay, and there'd be a bunch of spears behind them, and they would march, slowly forward. And they would drive any opponent from the field. There was one way to defeat a phalanx. It was costly. But if you came up to the point of the spears and you drew the spears into your chest all at once, then yes, you would die. But then your buddies could come around beside you possibly and break the phalanx by getting in between the shields. But other than that, this was a very, very hard tactic to defeat. The Greeks were shopkeepers and other townsmen. The Persians outnumbered them. They had some very fierce professional warriors, but the phalanx worked very well, even against the Persians. Marathon, if you recall the video we saw a little while ago, 10,000 Greeks beat 30,000 Persians. Thermopylae, where the 300 made their last stand, 5,000 to 6,000 Greeks against 100,000 Persians, and prevailed in both cases. Now, the hoplites, like Socrates, were drawn from the middle class, and hoplites had to supply their own equipment and armor. So the spears, the swords, the shields, etc., the greaves. And just like the cavalry also had to supply their own, that was a little more costly. So aristocrats, Alcibiades was a good example, joined the cavalry. Middle-class guys like Socrates, they became hoplites. If you were too poor to do either of those things, well, then you got duty in the galleys. You rode the warships, rode the warships. Well, that was an important job, as we saw. The Athenian navy, for a while, had complete superiority. Athens ruled the waves. Greeks were all warriors. If they weren't all jarheads, they had a direct democracy plus universal military service, kind of like Switzerland today. If you're a male, able-bodied male in Switzerland between, I think, something like age 19 and age 49, somewhere in there, you are in the military and you practice regularly. I remember I was in Switzerland once waiting for a restaurant to open, and I heard pop, 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 pop. That sounds like small arms fire. Round bend comes a guy on a motorcycle. He's got an assault weapon strapped on his back. Well, he was late for target practice that day. They were all supposed to assemble on Sunday morning for target practice, and they bring their own weapons. They store their weapons at home. They don't have an armory, so you can't capture the Swiss armory and beat them that way. The men will either assemble at prearranged assembly points, or they will fade into the hills and fight as guerrillas. Very, very effective tactic, citizen soldiers. And the Athenians were like that in that respect. So Socrates was one of the hoplites. And the whole society was kind of fierce. Plutarch tells a story about Spartan mothers. They would tell their sons, you go to war, come back with your shield or on it. Don't be captured, and don't run and come back without a victory. If you can't come back victorious with your shield, come back as a dead body on your shield, says Mama. And Socrates didn't just wear the uniform. He had experienced some bloody infantry combat up close and personal. The Battle of Delium, he's going to talk about his battles here in a minute. The enemy hoplites were 25 deep. The Athenians broke and ran. They threw off their armor and threw down their weapons. Socrates organized in the middle of this rout a bunch of soldiers around him. They formed a shield wall, and they fought themselves back out of the battleground and retreated in an orderly fashion. Alcibiades, who was a cavalryman on horseback at the time, and on horseback, of course, the cavalry are on horse, says this about Socrates. Here, indeed, I had an even finer view of Socrates than at Ptydia, where personally I had less reason for alarm as I was mounted, and I noticed first how he outdid Laches in collectedness, turning a calm, sidelong look at friend and foe alike, and convincing even from afar that whoever cares to touch this person will find that he can put up a stout enough defense. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, let me just make another point here first before we continue to read. He plays the veterans card. He also plays the scripture card, okay? Battlefield tactics may have changed since the time of Homer, but the warrior ethos did not. I'd rather die on my feet than live on my knees. A lot of people have attributed to have said that. Socrates clearly thought that. For warriors, there are some fates worse than death. Death may not be the worst thing to befall me. Death before dishonor. If you think about the samurai and their Kodo Bushido, very similar point there, death before dishonor. Not everybody agrees that there can be a fate worse than death. Some take the view that death is the worst evil that can befall us. Now, we're talking about Socrates here. When we come to talk about Hegel, Hegel's going to make a lot about this very same point. We'll compare Socrates and Hegel when we get down that road. If you fear death, that makes you a certain kind of person. If you don't fear death, that makes you another kind of person, and that structures social relationships in an ongoing way. I say that he plays the scripture card, Socrates does. It's a rough analogy. The Greeks were used to what are called religions of the book, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. They all have different combinations of books. Some of them overlap, obviously. The Greeks didn't really have a scriptural tradition like that, but they all had the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Homeric works, and that was as close as they got. They all knew these stories, by heart. Socrates, of course, quotes the Iliad. He talks about Achilles. He says, if you tell me, I should back off for fear of death, well, according to you, the demigods who died at Troy would be foolish, and among them Achilles, who thought nothing of danger when the alternative was disgrace. If you've seen the film Troy. By the way, I recommend seeing it just for the visual effects. It's a pretty good depiction of the kind of warfare that would have gone on among these people at that time. And great special effects with all the triremes, all the ships, going from Achaia to Troy. Classicists don't like it for various reasons. One of which is that the gods don't appear in this film. They're done from a completely secular point of view. And of course, if you read the Iliad, the gods are always conspiring and promoting their favorite human and demigod and playing with people like their pawns, and none of that appears in the film. But you do get a sense of what it would have been like from a human point of view. Achilles' mother was a goddess, Thetis. She says, don't kill Hector to avenge your friend Patroclus because you'll be next. And he said, hey, bring it. Let me punish the evildoer and afterwards die, that I may not remain here by these beaked ships encumbering the earth. And in addition to Homer, there was another example close to hand, Leonidas in the 300 at Thermopylae. Sparta, which was Athens' arch rival, was also a warrior society, although their warriors were not craftsmen and so forth. They had a lot more slaves to do their work. It was structured very differently. And the Spartans saw themselves as real tough guys. They looked down even upon the Athenians and other Greeks as lesser and weaker and less worthy. If you've seen the film The 300, again, for the visuals, it's worth seeing. Leonidas' wife, Gorga, was asked by a woman from Athens, or the region of Athens, why isn't the Spartan women lorded over their men? She said, well, because we're the only women that are mothers of men. And Socrates is kind of playing into this attitude, it seems. He's saying, you Athenians want me to back down? Well, think about our warrior traditions. It's unworthy to do that. If you thought about what you should be thinking, you wouldn't even ask me such a question. You wouldn't even think that. Now, these are proud people. These are people who just built the Parthenon, after all. And, Socrates' generation made Athens what it was and what we remember it for. And so, this may be taken as a slap in the face between the lines to the Athenians he's addressing. He has this reputation, Socrates, for being sort of pro-Spartan, and his friend and student Alcibiades, of course, defected to Sparta. Socrates was known to be Spartan in his own ways. Alcibiades, again, in the Symposium, says, when Socrates was out on military campaign, this man went out wearing his regular kind of cloak, and even barefoot as he walked on the ice more easily than everybody else with their boots on. So the soldiers looked at him with suspicion, thinking that he was looking down on them. And it's not impossible that they're doing the same thing now. And there's some digging there by Aristophanes as well. Socrates was like the Spartans in his hardiness, in his warrior ethic. So he was presented already as Laconomanes, as pro-Spartan. So even though he's playing the scripture card, and that's going to ring a bell, it's going to resonate with the Athenians, he's also doing it in such a way as possibly at the same time to slap them in their faces. He makes an interesting reference here in the passage we just read to duty. Whatever a man's station is, whether he has chosen it of his own will or whether he has been placed at it by his commander, there it is his duty to remain and face the danger without thinking of death or of any other thing except disgrace. And we talked about this again earlier in terms of the section on ethics, when we contrasted deontic and consequentialist views. But what exactly is duty? Remember, Kant had a rather unconventional way of thinking about duty. Socrates seems to have a fairly conventional one. He uses the example, my commander places me in the line, it is the private's fourth general order not to quit your post until relieved, basically. Duty is kind of complicated. Duty is obedience. That's the way Socrates seems to think of it all. We've seen that there are other ways to do that, and there are certainly problems with that. If you think about Antigone, what happens when duty conflicts with another duty? You know, the tragedy of Antigone, why we call it a tragedy, is that it is the conflict of right against right, not of right against wrong. That's what makes it basically a tragedy. And so, you know, Socrates is saying, I'm going to do my duty, and my duty is not to fear death. Okay, well, yeah, so, okay, something that he's doing here that's then not very diplomatic, but then diplomacy is not a deontic virtue, more of a consequentialist virtue. Socrates' take on duty, kind of like the Army's general orders, actually the fifth general order, I misquoted that. This is the World War II version. I'm told now that it's been reduced to about 4 general orders. But I, you know, I will not quit my post until properly relieved. That's what Socrates is saying. He did his duty, and he did so in the face of death. His commanders placed him in the line. He stayed in the line and fought. And now we're on page 40, picking up again, first new paragraph on the first column. When the generals, he's going to talk about his own battlefield record. When the generals whom you assigned to command me, Athenians, assigned me my station during the battles of Ptydia, Amphipolis, and Delium, I remained where they stationed me and ran the risk of death like other men. It would be very strange conduct on my part if I were to desert my station now from fear of death or any other thing, when the God has commanded me, as I'm persuaded that he has done, to spend my life in searching for wisdom and in examining myself and others. That would indeed be a very strange thing. Then certainly I might with justice be brought to trial for not believing in the gods, for I should be disobeying the oracle and fearing death and thinking myself wise when I was not wise. For to fear death, my friends, is only to think ourselves wise without really being wise. For it is to think we know what we do not know. For no one knows whether death might be the greatest good that can happen to man. But men fear it as if they knew quite well that it was the greatest of evils. And what is this but shameful ignorance of thinking that we know what we do not know? In this matter, too, my friends, perhaps I am different from the multitude. If I were to claim to be wiser, and all wiser than others, it would be because, not knowing very much about that other world, the other world, I do not think that I know. But I do know very well that it is evil and disgraceful to do an unjust act and to disobey my superior, whether God or man. I will never do what I know to be evil and shrink in fear from what I do not know to be good or evil. Even if you acquit me now and do not listen to Anaxagoras' argument that if I am to be acquitted, I ought never to have been brought to trial at all, and that as it is, you are bound to put me to death because, as he said, if I escape, all your sons will be utterly corrupted by practicing what Socrates teaches. If you were therefore to say to me, Socrates, this time we will not listen to Anaxagoras, we will let you go, but on the condition that you give up this investigation of yours in philosophy, if you are found following these pursuits again, you shall die. I say, if you offered to let me go on these terms, I should reply, Athenians, I hold you in the highest regard and affection, but I will be persuaded by the God rather than you. As long as I have breath and strength, I will not give up philosophy in exhorting you and declaring the truth to every one of you whom I meet, saying, as I am accustomed, my good friend, you are a citizen of Athens, a city which is very great and very famous for its wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of caring so much for the making of money and for fame and prestige, when you neither think nor care about wisdom and truth in the improvement of your soul? If he disputes my words and says that he does care about these things, I shall not at once release him and let him go away. I shall question him and cross-examine him and test him. If I think that he has not attained excellence, though he says that he has, I shall reproach him for undervaluing the most valuable things and overvaluing those that are less valuable. This shall I do to everyone whom I meet, whether young or old, citizen or stranger, but especially to citizens, since they are more closely related to me. And you must recognize the God has commanded me to do this. Okay. So, do the right thing. Don't consider the consequences, especially don't weigh the danger of death. I didn't. He cites his record in the war. All my life I have faced death and not feared it. Wouldn't it be strange now if all of a sudden I did that? And besides, I would be disobeying the God. I would be pretending to know something that I don't know. And that just goes against everything I've done my entire life. So, don't fear the reaper. Well, thus far, it might seem that Socrates, his case is going good, going well. He seems to have hit a strategy that might favor his acquittal. He's tried, first of all, to disarm those prior prejudices against him, Aristophanes and so forth. He's ruined poor little Meletus. He's played the veterans card, and he's played the scripture card, appealing to shared moral values. But he's not scored all home runs. He's gotten some digs in against democracy, the multitude, your democracy, all these kind of snide remarks. He has insulted the upright citizens brigade, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen. It's clear that he's not an atheist, but that may not have dispelled all the religious charges against him, I have stone and so forth. And he has played the scripture card, but the way in which he does it seems to favor the Spartans, perhaps over the Athenians. Again, not a diplomatic move. So we might say up to this point, he scored some points, he's lost some points, but he's about to lose some more. He's going to say some very undiplomatic things. He's going to tell the Athenians that they are lazy, sluggish, and even dishonest. He's going to declare that he is God's gift to Athens, and he's going to air some dirty laundry about recent political events that will probably be uncomfortable to a number of his hearers and indeed his jury members. This you must recognize, we're up at the very top first column of page 41. This you must recognize that God has commanded me to do. And I think that no greater good has ever befallen you in the state than my service to the God. I think that no greater good has ever befallen you in the state than my service to the God. Yeah, it's me, Socrates, God's gift to Athens. What happens to a man when he tells a woman he's God's gift to her? Socrates is a gadfly. We'll use this example in a minute. What's a gadfly? It's an annoying object. It looks like a fly, but bigger. Deer fly is kind of in between. Horsefly is really, really big. And they sting. They really do. And, he's going to say, basically, I've been given to you as a gadfly to wake you up like a little gadfly wakes up a drowsy horse. You should be happy that I do it because I'm doing this on behalf of the gods. But the thing about gadflies is people often think they need swatting. For I spend my whole life in going about and persuading you all to give your first and greatest care to the improvement of your souls, and not till you've done that to think about your bodies or your wealth. And I tell you that wealth does not bring excellence, but that wealth and every other good thing which we have, whether in public or in private, comes from excellence. If then I corrupt the youth by this teaching, these things must be harmful. But if any man says that I teach anything else, there is nothing in what he says. And therefore, Athenians, I say, whether you are persuaded by Anaxagoras or not, whether you acquit me or not, I shall not change my way of life. No, not if I have to die for it many times. Do not interrupt me, Athenians, with your shouts. Remember the request which I made to you, and do not interrupt my words. I think that it will profit you to hear them. For I'm going to say something more to you, which you may be inclined to protest, but do not do that. Be sure that if you put me to death, I, who am what I have told you that I am, you will do yourselves more harm than me. Meletus and Anaxagoras can do me no harm. That's impossible. For I am sure that it is not allowed that a good man be injured by a worse. That's a weird idea. I'm sure it is not allowed that a good man may be injured by a worse. Hold that thought. We'll come back to that. He may indeed kill me or drive me into exile or deprive me of my civil rights. Perhaps Meletus and others think those things great evils, but I do not think so. I think it is a much greater evil to do what he is doing now and to try to put a man to death unjustly. And now, Athenians, I'm not arguing in my own defense at all, as you might expect me to do, but rather in yours, in order that you may not make a mistake about the gift of the God to you by condemning me. For if you put me to death, you will not easily find another who, if I may use a ludicrous comparison, clings to the state as a sort of gadfly to a horse that is large and well-bred, but rather sluggish because of its size, so that it needs to be aroused. It seems to me that the God has attached me like to the state, and for I'm constantly alighting upon you at every point to arouse, persuade, and reproach each of you all day long. You will not easily find anyone else, my friends, to fill my place, and if you are persuaded by me, you will spare my life. You are indignant, as drowsy persons are when they are awakened, and of course, if you were persuaded by Anaxagoras, you could easily kill me with a single blow, and then sleep on undisturbed for the rest of your lives, unless the God in his care for you sends another to arouse you. And you may easily see that it is the God who has given me to your city. For it is not human, the way in which I have neglected all my own interests and allowed my private affairs to be neglected for so many years, while occupying myself unceasingly in your interests. Going to each of you privately like a father or an elder brother, trying to persuade him to care for human excellence. There would have been a reason for it if I gained any advantage by this, or if I had been paid for my exhortations. But you see yourselves that my accusers, though they accuse me of everything else without shame, have not had the shamelessness to say that I ever either exacted or demanded payment. To that they have no witness, and I think that I have sufficient witness to the truth of what I say, my poverty. Perhaps it may seem strange to you that though I go about giving this advice privately and meddling in others' affairs, yet I do not venture to come forward in the assembly and advise the state. You have often heard me speak of my reason for this, and in many places. It is that I have a certain divine guide, which is what Meletus has caricatured in his indictment. I have had it from childhood. It is a kind of voice which, whenever I hear it, always turns me back from something I was going to do, but never urges me to act. It's sort of free won't rather than free will, if you will. This is this daimonion that he's talking about. It is this which forbids me to take part in politics. And I think it does well to forbid me. For Athenians, it is quite certain that if I had attempted to take part in politics, I should have perished at once and long ago without doing any good either to you or to myself. And do not be indignant with me for telling the truth. There is no man who will preserve his life for long, either in Athens or elsewhere, if he firmly opposes the multitude and tries to prevent the commission of much injustice and illegality in the state. He who would really fight for justice must do so as a private citizen, not as a political figure, if he is to preserve his life, even for a short time. I will prove to you that this is so by very strong evidence. Actually, let me stop here before we go on to that. What Socrates is saying here is weird, perhaps in a number of ways. Comparing himself to a gadfly, and then saying that he doesn't participate in the life of the state. This is very un-Athenian, and Emily Wilson notes this of him. Socrates was an Athenian who behaved like a foreigner. Indeed, his whole life's work as a philosopher could be seen not merely as undemocratic, but as fundamentally un-Athenian. He's already offended the Athenians by his political alignment with the aristocrats and the oligarchs against the democracy, by his personal strangeness, that Alcibiades commented on, that Wilson referred to earlier. What would it mean to be an upstanding Athenian citizen in the time of Socrates? Well, the Greeks, like Athenians included, like pretty much every society throughout most of human history, we object to this, but most have not. We're very ethnocentric. If you were Greek, good for you. Otherwise, if you were a foreigner, you were low life. And if you were a male citizen, you were good. If you were a woman, a child, a slave, or a foreigner, you were you're outside the pale, beneath contempt. The Greeks have a word we've adopted, barbarian. It comes from the supposition that if you are not a Greek and you open your mouth, all that comes out is bar, 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 bar. So they call foreigners hoi barbaroi, the barbarians, because all they do is blabber, bar, 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 bar. They don't actually speak a proper language like Greek. They're really not human. Again, the population of Athens at the time, the citizens were actually a very small percentage, but they had this attitude. Now, Socrates was in this respect, as a citizen of Athens, a freeborn citizen, but in some other respects, he was out. One of the things it meant to be an upstanding citizen in Greece, in Athens, was to be demolishes, as they call it, peopleified, to take part in the life of the city, including such things as speaking in the assembly, serving on the council, so forth. Not to do that was to be a private person. The Greeks had a word for that too, idios. It's the root word of our word idiot, as well as our word idiosyncratic. And Socrates is saying, I do what I do. I choose to remain idios because if I'm too honest, if I took part in political life, if I was demosified, demosios, like everyone expects me to be and like everyone else is, then I wouldn't last very long. I just tell the truth too much. I must be a private citizen and not a public man, a strange, an idiot, etc. Now, it's worth noting here where Socrates was so much at odds with his contemporaries, he also becomes closer to us in modern circumstances. He stands up for the individual's right to dissent from the crowd. He insists on the priority of individual conscience over social control. This is what makes him alien in Athens, but it also is what makes him an exemplar for people down the ages, like John Stuart Mill or John Locke or Martin Luther King. Socrates was idiosyncratic. He was untypical for a Greek man of his day, but this has some larger consequences as well. Any man who opposed the mob would not keep his life very long. Well, this actually did happen. I mentioned the death squads. Critias, the relative of Plato, was involved in some of this. Theramenes, for example, here. You know, Socrates is basically saying democracy is mob rule, democracy is corrupt, and I'm not going to put my life at risk to participate in your democracy. Well, not a diplomatic thing to say to a group of Democrats who are trying you and already want your neck. And the daimonion, of course, we talked about that. I've had it from childhood. It's kind of a voice that I always hear. And again, something for which Socrates was notorious, another one of his idiosyncrasies. When he was on campaign as a young man, he would go off in a trance. You know, the other guys would be sitting around playing, you know, gambling games, whatever they do. He would go off, lean on his spear, maybe all night, and go into a trance and commune with his personal spirit, his daimonion. It's one of the things like walking around on ice without boots that they remembered about him. So he was an eccentric, idiosyncratic, argumentative person. That would have been, you know, annoying enough in other times. Maybe in these times, after the tyranny and the bad feeling, the death squads and all of that, this gets some added acceleration. Okay, let's see what he says about recent history. I will prove to you that this is so, that I would have put my life in danger, by very strong evidence, not by mere words, but by what you value more, actions. Listen then to what happened to me, that you may know that there is no man who could make me to consent to commit an unjust act from the fear of death, but that I would rather perish at once rather than give way. What I'm going to tell you may be commonplace in the law court, nevertheless it is true. The only office that I ever held in the state Athenians was that of counselor. When you wished to try the 10 admirals who did not rescue their men after the Battle of Argusinae as a group, which was illegal as you all came to think afterwards, the executive committee was composed of the members of the tribe Antiochus, to which I belong. On that occasion, I alone of the committee members opposed your illegal action and gave my vote against you. The orators were ready to impeach me and arrest me, and you were clamoring and urging them on with your shouts. But I thought that I ought to face the danger, with law and justice on my side, rather than join with you in your unjust proposal from fear of imprisonment or death. That was when the state was democratic. When the oligarchy came in, the 30 sent for me with 4 others to the council chamber and ordered us to bring Leon the Salaminian from Salamis that he might be put to death. They were in the habit of frequently giving similar orders to many others, wishing to implicate as many as possible in their crimes. But then I again proved, not by mere words, but by my actions, that, if I may speak bluntly, I do not care a straw for death, but that I do care very much, indeed, about not doing anything unjust or impious. That government, with all its power, did not terrify me into doing anything unjust. When we left the council chamber, the other 4 went over to Salamis and brought Leon across to Athens. I went home. And if the rule of 30 had not been overthrown soon afterwards, I should very likely have been put to death for what I did then. Many of you will be my witnesses in this matter. Incidentally, there's a story that Meletus was one of the people who went over and snagged Leon, brought him back to death. So Socrates is airing some very dirty laundry here. When you wished to try the 10 admirals, I was on the council. That was the people served in the council by lot. His tribe drew the lot, basically, so he was one of the people doing the duty. The Battle of Argonauti was a sad thing. The Athenians elected 10 admirals. They said, basically, you're in charge of the ships, go. 2 of the 10 were besieged. The remaining 8 fought the Spartans and just barely won. But they lost a lot of sailors, and their bodies were washed away, and they were not able to recover them and bury them. Now, when a soldier dies, it is a shocking thing. This is a photograph from World War II. This is the first photograph published during World War II of dead American troops. The government was not willing to do this for a while. In fact, every December 7th we celebrate, if that's the word, the attack on Pearl Harbor, and you see all the newsreel footage of the battleship Arizona burning. Nobody in America saw that in 1941. That was censored. There were photographers there taking the footage, but it wasn't released to the public. This is the first time they were able to see that. Now, it's shocking in any case, but for a Greek, of course, and think about antiquity, if you can't bury somebody's body, they are dishonored, and their soul, if they have one, will wander in torment for eternity. And when you want to dishonor somebody, you mistreat their body. This is what Achilles does. This is what happened to Queen with Hector. This is what happened to Queen Jezebel, and of course Antigone. The 8 admirals who made it back, 2 of them decided not to return to Athens. 6 returned, expecting they would get a victor's welcome because they'd won the battle. Instead, they were put on trial, charged as a group, and convicted, made to drink the hemlock, which is what's going to happen to Socrates. So this is an example Socrates uses to show how he defied the Democrats. He also says, I did the same thing with the case of the tyrants. I don't care. I don't care a straw for death. Nobody's going to make me do something unjust. And the fear of death is not going to sway me either. Let's see. Now, do you think that I could have remained alive all these years if I had taken part in public affairs and had always maintained the cause of justice like a good man and held it a paramount duty as it is to do so? Certainly not, Athenians, nor could any other man. But throughout my whole life, both in private and in public, whenever I have to take part in public affairs, you will find that I've always been the same and have never yielded unjustly to anyone, no, not to those whom my enemies falsely asserted to have been my pupils. But I was never anyone's teacher. I have never withheld myself from anyone, young or old, who was anxious to hear me converse while I was making my investigation. Neither do I converse for payment and refuse to converse without payment. I'm ready to ask questions of rich and poor alike. And if any man wishes to answer me, then I listen to what they have to, listen to what I have to say. He may. And I cannot justly be charged with causing these men to turn out good or bad, for I never either taught or professed to teach any of them any knowledge whatsoever. And if any man asserts that he ever learned or heard anything from me in private, which everyone else did not hear as well, be sure he does not speak the truth. Why is it then that people delight in spending so much time in my company? Well, you have heard why, Athenians. I told you the whole truth when I said that they delight in hearing me examine persons who think that they are wise when they are not wise. It's certainly very amusing to listen to. And as I have said, the God has commanded me to examine men, in oracles and in dreams and in every way which the divine will was ever declared to man. This is the truth, Athenians, and if it were not the truth, it would be easily refuted. For if it were really the case that I have already corrupted some of the young men and am now corrupting others, surely some of them, finding as they grew older that I had given them bad advice in their youth, would have come forward today to accuse me and take their revenge. Or if they were unwilling to do so themselves, surely their relatives, their fathers and brothers or others would, if I had done them any harm, have remembered it and taken their revenge. Certainly, I see many of them in court. Here is Crito of my own district to my own age, father of Critobulus. Here is Lysanias of Sphetus, the father of Eschides. Here also is Anaphon of Cephisus, the father of Epigenes. Then here are others whose brothers have spent their time in my company: Nicostratus, son of Theozototes, and brother of Theodotus. And Theodotus is dead, so he cannot at least entreat his brother to be silent. Here is Paralus, the son of Demodocus, and the brother of Theages. Here is Adimantus, the son of Ariston, whose brother Plato is here, and Entrodorus, whose brother is Aristodorus. And I can name many others to you, some of whom Meletus ought to have called as witnesses in the course of his own speech. But if he forgot to call them, let him call them now. I will yield the floor to him, and tell us if he has any such evidence. No, on the contrary, my friends, you will find all these men ready to support me, the corrupter who has injured their relatives, as Meletus and Anytus call me. Those of them who have been already corrupted might perhaps have some reason for supporting me, but what reason can their relatives have who are grown up and who are uncorrupted except the reason of truth and justice, that they know very well that Meletus is lying and that I'm speaking the truth? Well, my friends, this and perhaps much more like this, pretty much all I have to offer in my defense. There may be someone among you now who will be indignant when he remembers how, even in a less important trial than this, he begged and entreated the judges with many tears to acquit him and brought forward his children and many of his friends and relatives to court in order to appeal to your feelings, and then finds that I shall do none of these things, though I am what we would think the supreme danger. Perhaps he will harden himself against me when he notices this. It may make him angry, and he may cast his vote in anger. If it is so with any of you, I do not suppose that it is, but in case it should be so, I think I should answer him reasonably if I said, my friends, I have relatives too, for in the words of Homer, I am not born of an oak or a rock, but of flesh and blood. And so, Athenians, I have relatives, and I have 3 sons, one of them nearly grown up, the other 2 still children. Yet I will not bring any of them forward before you and implore you to acquit me. And why will I do none of these things? Well, it is not from arrogance, Athenians, nor because I lack respect for you. Whether or not I can face death bravely is another question. But for my own good name, and for your own good name, and for the good name of the whole state. I do not think it is right, at my age and with my reputation, to do anything of that kind. Rightly or wrongly, men have made up their minds that in some way Socrates is different from the multitude of men. And it will be shameful if those of you who are thought to excel in wisdom or in bravery or in any other excellence are going to act in this fashion. I have often seen men of reputation behaving in an extraordinary way at their trial, as if they thought it a terrible fate to be killed, and though they expected to live forever if you did not put them to death. Such men seem to me to bring shame upon the state, for any stranger would suppose that the best and most eminent Athenians who are selected by their fellow citizens to hold office and for other honors are no better than women. Those of you Athenians who have any reputation at all ought not to do these things, and you ought not to allow us to do them. You should show that you will be much more ready to condemn men who make the state ridiculous by these pathetic performances than men who remain quiet. But apart from the question of reputation, my friends, I do not think it is right to entreat the judge to acquit us or to escape condemnation in that way. It is our duty to teach and persuade him. He does not sit to give justice away as a favor, but to pronounce judgment. And he has sworn not to favor any man whom he would like to favor, but to judge according to law. And therefore, we ought not to encourage you in the habit of breaking your oaths. And you ought not to allow yourselves to fall into this habit, for then neither you nor we would be acting piously. Therefore, Athenians, do not require me to do these things, for I believe them to be neither good, nor just, nor pious. Especially, do not ask me to do them today, when Meletus is prosecuting me for impiety. For were I to be successful and persuade you by my entreaties to break your oaths, I should be clearly teaching you to believe that there are no gods, and I should be simply accusing myself by my defense of not believing in them. But Athenians, that is very far from the truth. I do believe in the gods, as no one of my accusers believes in them. And to you and the God, I commit my cause to be decided as is best for you and for me. Okay, so that's a good summing up speech, I guess. I can't do what you expect me to do conventionally. I'm still going to be unconventional to the end, because if I did what people usually do, then I would really be doing an irreligious act, and I'm accused of being irreligious. I would be convicting myself by my own testimony. But of course, you know, there's also a backhanded compliment there. Why do you allow people to do this, and why have some of you done that? Shame on you. Well, jurors had 2 discs, metal discs. Hollow was guilty, solid was innocent. They filed by the ballot box, and here it is. It's actually the box that they used, dropped in the one they wanted and discarded the other one. And as a result of that vote, Socrates is found guilty. We don't know, it was either 500 or 501. So the majority is either 280 or 281. The number of jurors would vary. By a slim margin, Meletus got his minimum. Remember, the minimum he needed was 20% of the votes. So that was, out of a jury of 500, that would be 100 votes. He clearly got more than that, so he doesn't have to pay the fine. But Socrates is found guilty. And now we go to the penalty phase. We know that Meletus has proposed death. Let's see what Socrates proposes. He gets to speak. Whoops, let's go back here. I am not indignant at the verdict which you have given, Athenians, for many reasons. I expected that you would find me guilty, and I'm not so much surprised at that as at the numbers of the votes. I certainly would never have thought that the majority against me would have been so narrow. But now it seems that if only 30 votes had changed sides, I should have escaped. So I think I have escaped Meletus as it is, and not only have I escaped him, it is perfectly clear that if Anytus and Lycon had not come forward to accuse me too, he would not have attained the 5th part of the votes and would have had to pay a fine of 1,000 drachmae. So he proposes death as the penalty. Be it so. And what alternative penalty should I propose to you? Well, what I deserve, of course, must I not? What then do I deserve to pay or to suffer for having determined not to spend my life in ease? I neglected all the things men most value, such as wealth and family interests and military commands, and public oratory, and all the civic appointments and social clubs and political factions that there are in Athens. For I thought that I was really too honest a man to preserve my life if I engaged in these affairs. So I did not go where I should have done no good either to you or to myself. I went instead to each of you privately to do him, as I say, the greatest of benefits, and tried to persuade him not to think of his affairs until he had thought of himself, and tried to make himself as good and wise as possible, not to think of the affairs of Athens until he had thought of Athens herself, and to care for other things in the same manner. Then what do I deserve for such a life? Something good, Athenians, if I am really to propose what I deserve, and something good which it would be suitable for me to receive. Okay, so what are going to be the proposed penalties? Then what is a suitable reward to be given to a poor benefactor who requires leisure to exhort you? There is no reward, Athenians, so suitable for him as receiving free meals in the Prytaneum. It is a much more suitable reward for him than for any of you who has won a victory at the Olympic Games with his horse or his chariots. Such a man only makes you seem happy, but I make you really happy. He is not in want, but I am. So, if I am to propose the penalty which I really deserve, I propose this: free meals in the Prytaneum. So here we have it. The choice is between death or free meals in the Prytaneum. What was the Prytaneum? Remember, we talked about the geographic layout of the Agora. Remember that building with the round roof, the sunshade hat, the tolos? Well, that is the Prytaneum building. It's a building where the city council met. And Socrates already alluded to, it was on a rotating basis. While the council members were on duty, they slept in the building and they ate in the building. It's kind of like if you know the army, there's always an officer of the day. There's always got to be somebody on duty 24 hours around the clock. So when the commanding officer goes home at 5 o'clock, the officer of the day, it's usually a junior lieutenant, takes charge and stays in command, keeps things running, kind of a skeleton crew. And that's more or less what they were doing here. Okay, so what's Socrates asking for? He's asking to be honored in the same way that city councilors are and famous athletes, by being put up and fed in this prestigious building. Translate that into our terms. He's asking basically that you put him up in the Beverly Hills Hotel and you take him to dinner every night at Phaedo. Okay. Perhaps you think me stubborn and arrogant in what I'm saying now, as in what I said about the entreaties and tears. It is not so, Athenians. It is rather that I am convinced that I never wronged a man voluntarily, though I cannot persuade you of that. since we have conversed together only a little time. If there were a law at Athens, as there is elsewhere, not to finish a trial of life and death in a single day, I think I could have persuaded you. But now it is not easy in so short a time to clear myself of great prejudices. But when I am persuaded that I have never wronged any man, I shall certainly not wrong myself, or admit that I deserve to suffer any evil or propose any evil for myself as a penalty. Why should I? Lest I should suffer the penalty which Meletus proposes when I say that I do not know whether it is a good or an evil. Shall I choose instead of it something which I know to be an evil, and propose that as a penalty? Shall I propose imprisonment? And why should I pass the rest of my days in prison, the slave of successive officials? Or shall I propose a fine with imprisonment until it's paid? I have told you why I will not do that. I should have to remain in prison, for I have no money to pay a fine with. Shall I then propose exile? Perhaps you would agree to that. Life would indeed be very dear to me if I were unreasonable enough to expect that strangers would cheerfully tolerate my discussions and arguments when you, who are my fellow citizens, cannot endure them and have found them so irksome and odious to you that you are now seeking now to be relieved of them. No, indeed, Athenians, that's not likely. A fine life I should lead for an old man if I were to withdraw from Athens and pass the rest of my days in wandering from city to city and continually being expelled. Think about what Meletus said, Socrates, you're a rogue. If you were in any other city, in Athens, they would expel you. For I know very well that the young men will listen to me wherever I go, as they do here. If I drive them away, they will persuade their elders to expel me. If I do not drive them away, their fathers and other relatives will expel me for their sakes. Perhaps someone will say, why cannot you withdraw from Athens, Socrates, and hold your peace? It is the most difficult thing in the world to make you understand why I cannot do that. If I say that I cannot hold my peace because that would be to disobey the god, you will think that I am not in earnest and will not believe me. And if I tell you that no greater good can happen to a man than to discuss human excellence every day and the other matters about which you have heard me arguing and which you have heard me arguing and examining myself and others, and that an unexamined life is not worth living, then you will believe me less. An unexamined life is not worth living. There are certainly things worse than death, an unexamined life being one of them. That's one of the famous things in which Socrates is known to have said. Now, it's kind of unusual. I mean, Socrates had friends. He probably could have found a rich friend living outside of Athens, maybe even in another city. He could have stayed maybe in a country estate. And indeed, there were people sympathetic to him. His jailers didn't want to see him die. They said, look, Socrates, tonight we're going to leave the back door open and loosen your chains, and you can just slip out the back and nobody will be the wiser, nobody will say anything about it. Socrates says, no. Imagine that you were given the choice. Imagine that you were in one of those jurisdictions where you put to death, but you can choose the method of your punishment. In this case, you're able to choose between death and an alternative punishment. Your choice is this. You can remain in Los Angeles, where you live, and be put to death, but you'll die as an Angelino. Or you can go up to Malibu and live in the mansion of a rich friend. Are we going to be like Jack Benny? Oh, let's see. One of your life. I'm thinking about it. Well, for most of us, the choice would be clear. But for Socrates, it's also clear in the other direction. He is an Athenian. He cannot think of himself living outside of Athens. He would rather die as an Athenian than live elsewhere. And also, he does so, as he will say later, out of obedience to the law. It's toward Athens which the god has assigned him and given him his duty. Apart from his military service, he never left Athens, didn't even go to Piraeus, the port, or to the countryside. Trees in the open countryside, he says, won't teach me anything, whereas men in the city do. So he chooses to die as an Athenian rather than even to maybe escape into exile. Because an unexamined life is not worth living. But that is so, my friends, though it is not easy to persuade you. And what is more, I am not accustomed to think that I deserve anything evil. If I had been rich, I would have proposed as large a fine as I could pay, and that would have done me no harm. But I'm not rich enough to pay a fine unless you are willing to fix it at a sum within my means. Perhaps I could pay you a mina, so I propose that. Plato here, Athenians, and Credo and Critobulus and Apollodorus bid me propose 30 minae, and they guarantee its payment. So I propose 30 minae. Their security will be sufficient to you for the money. Socrates didn't have a lot of money, but he had rich friends who could pay him. So, so that's what he leaves it with. Meletus proposes death. He says, put me up with Britannium, or, if you must do something punishing toward me, okay, I can pay a small fine. My friends will pay it for me. Stone makes an interesting comment. Socrates looks more like a picador enraging a bull than a defendant trying to mollify a jury. And it's worth asking, is he just committing suicide by cop here? He's already 70 years old. Old age is not going to be kind to him. As methods of dying in execution go, hemlock is fairly benign. We'll talk about that when we come to the day he dies. He's going to embarrass his enemies who did this to him, and becoming a martyr is going to win him undying fame. I'm not sure he could be sure of this, but that's exactly what happened. Socrates was old when he was tried, and now it seems to me, says Xenophon, that he seems to me to have met a fate that the gods love, for he escaped the hardest part of life and met the easiest sort of death. So the jury votes once again. This time, the margin is much greater. 360 to 140, whereas it was almost even in the case of conviction. We're not sure whether they're voting on the fine or the Britannium, but whatever it is, they're voting in Socrates' penalty. They many more votes for Meletus' penalty, the death sentence. Scholarly grounds to doubt Diogenes' report that after Socrates' speech, so many more voted for death than voted for simple guilt. Assuming that they did, why would they have done so? Emily Wilson suggests a reason. Socrates was not put to death as a direct result of the actual crimes for which he'd been charged, impiety and corruption, nor even for his political beliefs, which could hardly have altered between the time of his conviction and the passing of the sentence. He was executed for his manner. As much as anything else that the jury decided to put him to death, he just pissed them off all the way to the very end. Okay, he's condemned to death, but as arrangements are being made to take him around the corner to the prison where he will end his life, he gets a chance for a few more words, and here's what he says. You have not gained very much time, Athenians, and at the price of the slurs of those who wish to revile the state. And they will say that you put Socrates, a wise man, to death, for they will certainly call me wise, whether I'm wise or not, when they want to reproach you. If you had waited for a little while, your wishes would have been fulfilled in the course of nature, for you see that I am an old man far advanced in years and very near to death. I am saying this not to all of you, but only to those who have voted for my death, and to them I have something else to say. Perhaps, my friends, you think I have been convicted because I was wanting in the arguments by which I could have persuaded you to acquit me if I had thought it right to do or say anything to escape punishment. It is not so. I have been convicted because I was wanting not in arguments, but in impudence and shamelessness. Because I would not plead before you as you would have had liked to hear me plead, or appeal to you with weeping and wailing, or say and do many other things which I maintain are unworthy of me, but which you have been accustomed to from other men. And when I was defending myself, I thought that I ought not to do anything unworthy of a free man because of the danger which I ran, and I have not changed my mind now. I would much rather defend myself as I did and die than as you would have had me to do and live. Both in a lawsuit and in war, there are many things which neither I nor any other man may do in order to escape from death. In battle, a man often sees that he may at least escape from death by throwing down his arms and falling on his knees before his pursuer to beg for his life. There are many other ways of avoiding death in every danger if a man is willing to say and do anything. But my friends, I think it is a much harder thing to escape from wickedness than from death, for wickedness is swifter than death. And now I, who am old and slow, have been overtaken by the slower pursuer, and my accusers, who are clever and swift, have been overtaken by the swifter pursuer, wickedness. And now I shall go away sentenced by you to death, and they will go away sentenced by truth to wickedness and injustice. And I abide by this award as well as they. Perhaps it was right for these things to be so. I think that they are fairly balanced. Ponerion tatungar tanatute. Wickedness is swifter than death. I go to death, but they go away to wickedness. The English translation here doesn't really do justice to this. Ponerion comes from a word for a sweaty worker, and it's a class-based term. We'll talk about this, by the way, when we come to talk about Nietzsche and the genealogy of morals and the transvaluation of values. But what Socrates is saying is, you know, you're sentenced to wickedness. Wickedness doesn't cover it. You are the lowest of the low. You are the scum of the earth, and you have made yourself that way. So I figure I got a good deal. I'm only going to die. You have to live with yourselves and this kind of thing that you're capable of doing. And now I wish to prophesy to you, Athenians, who have condemned me, for I'm going to die, and that is the time when men have most prophetic power. And I prophesy to you, who put me to death, that a far more severe punishment than you have inflicted on me will surely overtake you as soon as I am dead. You have done this thing, thinking that you will be relieved from having to give an account of your lives. But I say the result will be very different. There will be more men who will call you to account, whom I have held back, though you did not recognize it, and they will be harsher toward you than I have been, and they will be younger, and you will be more indignant with them. For if you think that you will restrain men from reproaching you for not living as you should by putting them to death, you're very much mistaken. That way of escape is neither possible nor honorable. It is much more honorable and much easier not to suppress others, but to make yourselves as good as you can. This is my parting prophecy to you who have condemned me. Joe Hill was a labor organizer in Utah in the copper mines about a century ago, and the bosses of the copper mines trumped up a murder charge against him, tried him, and shot him. And his last words were, "Don't waste time mourning, organize." He was a union man to the end. Joan Baez sang the song about him as a folk song at Woodstock, and let's just listen to a bit from that song.
I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I, but Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he.
From San Diego up to Maine, in every mine and mill where working men defend their rights, it's there you'll find Joe Hill. This is what Socrates is saying. You can't kill an idea. You know, you can shoot Joe Hill, but then the spirit of Joe Hill will come back at you with Hydra head, basically, many other forms. Even if all the roosters are silenced, the dawn shall still come, says a contemporary Chinese dissident. So that's what he has to say to those who voted to convict him. Now he's going to talk to the people who voted for him. With you who have acquitted me, I should like to discuss this thing that has happened while the authorities are busy and before I go to the place where I have to die. So remain with me until I go. There is no reason why we should not talk with each other while it is possible. I wish to explain to you, as my friends, the meaning of what has happened to me. An amazing thing has happened to me, judges, for I'm right in calling you judges. The prophetic guide has been constantly with me through all my life till now, opposing me even in trivial matters if I were not going to act rightly. And now you yourselves see what has happened to me, a thing which might be thought, and which is sometimes actually reckoned, the supreme evil. But the divine guide did not oppose me when I was leaving my house in the morning, nor when I was coming up here to the court, nor at any point in my speech when I was going to say anything. Though at other times it has often stopped me in the very act of speaking. But now, in this matter, it has never once opposed me, either in my words or my actions. I will tell you what I believe to be the reason. the thing that has come upon me, must be a good. And those of us who think that death is an evil must needs be mistaken. I have a very clear proof that this is so. For my accustomed guide, this is daimonion, of course, would certainly have opposed me if I had not been going to meet with something good. And if we reflect in another way, we shall see that we may well hope that death is a good. For the state of death is one of two things. Either the dead man wholly ceases to be and loses all consciousness, or, as we are told, it is a change and a migration of the soul to another place. And if death is the absence of all consciousness, and like the sleep of one whose slumbers are unbroken by any dreams, it will be a wonderful gain. For if a man had to select that night in which he slept so soundly that he did not even dream, and had to compare it with all the other nights and days of his life, and then had to say how many days and nights in his life he had spent better and more pleasantly than that night, I think that a private person, nay, even the great king of Persia himself, would find them easy to count compared with the others. If that is the nature of death, I for one count it a gain. For then it appears that all time is nothing more than a single night. But if death is a journey to another place, and what we've been told is true, that all who have died are there, what good could be greater than this, my judges? Would a journey not be worth taking, at the end of which, in another world, we should be delivered from the pretended judges here, and should find the true judges who are said to sit in judgment below, such as Minos and Rhadamanthus and Achaeus and Triptolemus, and all the other demigods who were just in their own lives? Or what would you not give to converse with Orpheus and Musaeus and Hesiod and Homer? I am willing to die many times if this be true. And for my own part, I should find it wonderful to meet there Palamedes and Ajax, son of Telamon, and the other men of old who have died through an unjust judgment, and to compare my experiences with theirs. That, I think, would be no small pleasure. And, above all, I could spend my time in examining those who are there as I examine men here, and in finding out which of them is wise and which of them thinks himself wise when he is not wise. What would we not give, my judges, to be able to examine the leader of the great expedition against Troy, or Odysseus, or Sisyphus, or countless other men and women whom we could name? It would be an inexpressible happiness to converse with them and live with them and to examine them. Assuredly, they do not put men to death for doing that. For besides, the other ways in which they are happier than we are, they are immortal, at least if what we are told is true. So, anybody who tells you they know what death is lying to you. But it stands to reason we can guess what it might be, some probable ideas, and these are the two probable ideas. Either death is the big sleep, or else it's rock and roll heaven. It's just a one-night stand. If there's a rock and roll heaven, well, you know they got a hell of a band. Yeah, you could hear Jimi Hendrix, or you could hear Charlie Parker playing in the astral dimension. Yeah. Here is rock and roll heaven, Greek style. He would interrogate all the heroes that he names, mentions Palamedes, etc. And besides, after you're dead, they don't put you to death for asking questions. And then he finishes. And you two judges must face death hopefully and believe this one truth, that no evil can happen to a good man either in life or after death. His affairs are not neglected by the gods, and what has happened to me today has not happened by chance. I am persuaded that it was better for me to die now and so to be released from trouble, and that was the reason why the guide never turned me back. And so I am not at all angry with my accusers or with those who have condemned me to die. And yet it was not with this in mind that they accused and condemned me, but meaning to do me an injury. So far, I may blame them. This is kind of a weird view. No evil could happen to a good man either in life or after death. Meletus and Anaxagoras cannot do me any harm, for I am sure that it is not allowed that a good man be injured by words. What could this mean? In one sense, it's obviously false. Any punk can take the life of a better man at the drop of a hat, and isn't it an injury to lose years of your life you might otherwise have enjoyed? And can't good things happen to bad people? Is Socrates meaning to deny that sort of thing? Maybe he has in mind something like this. Nietzsche says, one only praises one's peers. Therefore, whoever praises me is saying, I am your peer. Watch it when people flatter you. You know, they're saying, I'm your equal. Maybe they're not. Maybe they're not. Maybe they don't have a right to praise you. Maybe Socrates, in an aristocratic dig against his democratic judges, is saying that they are just so beneath my contempt that they can't do me an injury, which is not quite the same thing as saying that bad things cannot happen to good people. Socrates thinks that death is not an evil, so much that it's not clearly the ultimate penalty. But, you know, if forcing a person to die is to degrade that person, well, the Athenian democracy does seem capable of harming Socrates and is certainly willing to do that. Okay. And then 2 paragraphs, and he ends his speech. Yet I have one request to make of them. When my sons grow up, punish them, my friends, and harass them in the same way I have harassed you, if they seem to you to care for riches or for anything other more than excellence. And if they think that they are really something when they are really nothing, reproach them as I have reproached you for not caring for what they should, and for thinking that they are something when really they are nothing. And if you will do this, I myself and my sons will have received justice from you. But now the time has come, and we must go away. I to die and you to live. Which is better is known to the God alone. Okay, we're going to turn to the dialogue called Phaedo, and we're going to go to the very, very end of the dialogue. Last couple of pages, let's see, which, well, in Poimon's second edition is page 84. Okay, but let's do a little preliminary thinking first. Okay, here's the map again of Athens, the Stoa where he met Euthyphro in the red oval, the Tholos, the Prytaneum in the purple, the Aqua, the prison where he's going to be executed, and then the court in yellow where he's just been tried. This is what the prison looks like today, ground view, and there is a map of the foundation stones. Again, you know, like everything else in the Agora, it's the foundation stones alone which survive. Here's another view of the same prison. And yet again, this is an artist's reconstruction. The buildings closest to us are cells. They have open doorways. The prison itself is not very high security. The prisoners were chained individually so they couldn't run off, but people could come and go as they please. You could have conjugal visits. Your family could bring you food. In fact, they better, because if you were there for a very long time, they better, because the prison didn't feed its inmates. If families didn't, they starved. Although people were often there not for a very long time. You know, it was an execution jail, and execution was fairly swift. Here is another view, and we have reason to think that where the blue text is, that was Socrates' cell. Because it mentions that he goes into the next room and takes a bath, and there, the next room right to him, there you can see next to him is the room with the bathtub. Okay, so basically that's again another view of what we're looking at there. Now, Socrates waited in prison for a while. Why? Well, again, normally he would have been executed that same day, but there was a religious festival going on, and law and custom in Athens said that executions could not take place during religious festivals. This was the trip to Delos. The Athenians, like other cities, sent a delegation on a boat to that island. Here's a map, basically. Paros here, where Evenus came from, you can see just north of it is Delos, right next to Mykonos. And you can see a couple of the routes from there to the port of Piraeus, the port of Athens. By the way, it's an interesting place to visit. It was a major cultic site. It's right next to the island of Mykonos. Mykonos is party central. All night long, people are dancing. There's great beaches, good cheap food. It's a wonderful place. But I'm the sort of person, I like sun and sand and so forth, but I like something else. And this is cool because you can go, from Mykonos, you can take a day trip, morning trip, and go visit Delos, and you can come back for the beaches in the afternoon and then the nightlife all night long. I mean, I seriously mean all night long. Last time I was there, I had an early flight out, and 5 o'clock I was trying to take a taxi. People were still stumbling out of the bars at 5 in the morning. So it's a place to go, place to visit. Along with Delphi, Delos was a major Panhellenic religious site. The Delian League, of which Athens was the head, the treasury was there on Delos. This is where Apollo and Artemis were, brother and sister were apparently born. Here's what it looks like today. Again, surprise, surprise, it's mostly in ruins. And there we have it. And this is what it would have looked like in the day. Okay, so we're going to read from the Phaedo. This is Socrates' last couple of minutes. We're going to start on page 84, the first new paragraph of the first column. When he'd spoken, Crito said, "Very well, Socrates, what instructions have you for these others or for me about your children or anything else? What could we do that would be of most service to you?" "Well, I'm always telling you, Crito," he said, "and nothing very new. If you take care of yourselves, your actions will be of service to me and mine, and to yourselves too, whatever they may be, even if you make no promises now. But if you take no care for yourselves and are unwilling to pursue your lives along the tracks, as it were, marked by our present and earlier discussions, then even if you make many firm promises at this time, you'll do no good at all. Then we'll strive to do as you say," he said. "But in what fashion are we to bury you?" "However you wish," he said, "provided you can catch me, that is to say, I don't get away from you." And with this, he laughed quietly, looked toward us and said, "Friends, I can't persuade Crito here that I am Socrates here, the one who is now conversing and arranging each of the things being discussed. But he imagines I'm that dead body he'll see in a little while. And so he goes and asks how he's to bury me. But as for the great case I've been arguing all this time, that when I drink the poison, I shall no longer remain with you, but shall go off and depart for some happy state of the blessed. This, I think, I'm putting to him in vain, while comforting you and myself alike. So please stand surety for me with Crito, the opposite surety to that which he stood for me with the judges. His guarantee was that I would stay behind, whereas you must guarantee that when I die, I shall not stay behind, but shall go off and depart. Then Crito will bear it more easily, and when he sees the burning or interment of my body, he will be distressed for me, as if I were suffering dreadful things, and he won't say at the funeral that it is Socrates we are laying out or bearing to the grave or interring. Because you can be sure, my dear Crito, that misuse of words is not only troublesome in itself, but actually has a bad effect on the soul." That's an interesting idea. Words have an effect on the soul. Karl Popper famously will deny this later on. Words are not important, he'll say, basically. Rather, Socrates continues, "you should have confidence and say, you are burying my body, and bury it however you please and think most proper." This is a weird idea. Think again to the Battle of Argusinae. Why were the admirals put to death? Because they didn't bury the bodies. Okay. Burying the body is very important to the Greeks, but Plato has already introduced this new idea of the soul. Socrates is going with this. He says, the body is just a house for the soul, and once the soul departs, it's just a husk. Now, that seems very commonplace to us because, as Nietzsche has said, Christianity is popular Platonism. Christianity has spread that notion, and even people who aren't believing Christians, it's become secularized, it's become part of our general culture. But see, it wasn't among the Greeks. It was a very weird and shocking idea, and this is why I guess Socrates has to explain himself even to there. We just say, burn my body, use it for scientific research, whatever, it's just a body, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. But Socrates is one of the first to think seriously about a soul surviving. After saying this, he rose and went into a room to take a bath, and Crito followed him but told us to wait. So we waited, talking among ourselves about what had been said and reviewing it, and then again dwelling on how great a misfortune had befallen us, literally thinking of us if we were deprived of a father and would lead the rest of our lives as orphans. After he'd bathed and his children had been brought to him, had two little sons and a big one, and the women of his household had come, he talked with them in Crito's presence and gave certain directions as to his wishes. Then he told the women and children to leave and himself returned to us. By now it was close to sunset, and he'd spent a long time inside. So he came and sat down fresh from his bath, and there wasn't much talk after that. Then the prison official came in, stepped up to him and said, "Socrates, I shan't reproach you as I reproach others for being angry with me and cursing. Whatever by order of the rulers, I direct them to drink the poison. In your time here, I've known you for the most generous, gentlest, and best of men who've ever come to this place. And now especially I feel sure it isn't with me you're angry, but with others, because you know who are responsible. Well now, you know the message I've come to bring. Goodbye then, and try to bear the inevitable as easily as you can." And with this, he turned away in tears and went off. Socrates looked up at him and said, "Goodbye to you too, and we'll do as you say." And to us he added, "What a civil man he is. Throughout my time here, he's been to see me and sometimes talked with me and been the best of fellows. And now, how generous of him to weep for me. But come on, Credo, let's obey him. Let someone bring the poison if it has been prepared, or if not, let the man prepare it. Credo said, but Socrates, I think the sun is still in the mountains and hasn't gone down. And besides, I know of others who have taken the draught long after the order has been given them, and after dining well and drinking plenty, and even in those cases, in some cases, enjoying themselves with those they fancied, having sex, in other words. Be in no hurry, then. There's still time left. Okay, they've been watching the sun set because the day that the ship came back from Delos, that was the day that the execution could begin. So somebody watched for it, probably from Cape Sunion, and came running back and said, this is it. This is the last day. When the sun goes down, that's it. Socrates said, it's reasonable for you who speak to do those things, because they think they gain by doing them. For myself, it's reasonable not to do them, because I think I'll gain nothing by taking the draft a little later. I'll only earn my own ridicule by clinging to life and being sparing when there's nothing more left. Go on now, do as I ask and nothing else. Hearing this, Credo nodded to the boy who was standing nearby. The boy went out, and after spending a long time away, he returned, carrying the poison, bringing the man who was going to administer the poison, who was carrying it ready pounded in a cup. When he saw the man, Socrates said, well, my friend, you're an expert in these things. What must one do? Simply drink it, he said, and walk about till a heaviness comes over your legs. Then lie down, and it will act of itself. And with this, he held out the cup to Socrates. So, Socrates is being given a precise method of execution, drinking a cup of poison called hemlock. He is given the poison, and then he is to drink it himself. Now, there are societies in which there is one law for the poor and one law for the rich. We purport to be a society in which it's not. So if a rich man is sentenced to death, he will be electrocuted or given a lethal injection or whatever, the same as a poor man. The difference is, of course, rich men usually don't get sentenced to death at all. Poor men often do. But there have been societies in the past in which, let's say, if you were just a commoner, you got hanged, like this guy, and this is the slow method of hanging. It takes maybe a half an hour to strangle to death, not the quick drop where your neck is broken. But if you are noble, you may get a quick death like beheading. Anne Boleyn, for example, Henry VIII allowed her to have a swordsman. He had to send over to Calais across the channel and get a French swordsman who took off her head rather quickly. That's probably, who can tell, probably a less painful form of death than many others. I used to teach criminology, and there was an article, a recent article at the time by an MD who said, when people are put to death, how do they die? Now, of course, we can't know from testimony, but you can kind of figure out how various methods act. And so he detailed this in his article. It was pretty clear from his article that electrocution was the most painful means of death. You're probably conscious while it's happening. Your body is being cooked in its own fat, basically, from the inside. The last thing that you hear is a big exhaust fan going on above your head because the smell is going to be horrific. It's to protect the people watching your execution from that. And so I have my students read the article and say, okay, come back on Friday morning and we'll talk about it. And I would say, okay, now, you guys have read the article. If you were in one of those jurisdictions where you could choose the method of execution, you were condemned to death, what would you choose? And most people chose electrocution, which told me that they hadn't read the article. Why did you choose it? Well, because we've seen it on TV and the guy just goes, flops his head when he's dead. They hadn't read what it really is all about. So presumably there are more or less painful ways of dying. Hemlock apparently is one of the less painful ways. And it was available to the rich. If you were not a citizen or not able to afford the poison, you would be crucified. This is where the Romans get their idea of crucifixion from the Greeks. It's kind of like in the Soviet Union. They would execute a man and then send the family a bill for a cartridge that was used in the basement of Lubyanka prison. So Socrates is among those fortunate ones who can afford the hemlock, and so he's administered it. Now, this is the famous scene from the painting by Jacques-Louis David, hangs in the Metropolitan in New York. of Socrates taking the cup of poison. And this is the standard drinking cup that Greeks would have used at their parties, at the symposia, for example, such as the one Plato describes. This is not the cup, though, that was used to administer the poison. They've been found by archaeologists, and this is what they were. It was a very small amount, and it was basically a shot glass, and you just drank it down, and then it went to work. You can read the details about the poisoning. Bethany Hughes, I mentioned her, she goes into this in some detail about the way in which it works, if you're so interested. And with this, he held out the cup to Socrates. He took it perfectly calmly, Echecrates, without a tremor or any change of color or countenance. But looking up at the man and fixing him with his customary stare, he said, "What do you say to pouring someone a libation from this drink? Is it allowed or not?" "We only prepare as much as we judge the proper dose, Socrates," he said. What's Socrates asking to do? What's a libation? Well, this is from a piece of pottery that's in the museum at Delphi. A libation was a way that you honored a god. So if you had a cup of wine, for example, before you started the symposium, everybody would pour out a little bit in honor of the god. If you've ever seen somebody pour out one for the homies, it's exactly the same custom. Can I do this? No, there's only enough to work. I understand, says Socrates, but at least one may pray to the gods, and so one should, that the removal from this world to the next will be a happy one. That is my own prayer, so may it be. With these words, he pressed the cup to his lips and drank it off with good humor without the least distaste. And there is the famous painting of the scene. Till then, most of us had been fairly well able to restrain our tears, but when we saw he was drinking, and he'd actually drunk it, we could do so no longer. In my own case, the tears came pouring out in spite of myself, so that I covered my face and wept for myself, not for him, no, but for my own misfortune in being deprived of such a man for a companion. Even before me, Crito had moved away when he was unable to restrain his tears, and Apollodorus, who had even earlier been continuously in tears, now burst forth in such a storm of weeping and grieving that he made everyone present break down except Socrates himself. But Socrates said, "What a way to behave, my strange friends. Why, it is mainly for this reason I sent the women away, so they wouldn't make this sort of trouble. In fact, I've heard one should die in silence. Come now, calm yourselves and have strength." When we heard this, we were ashamed and checked our tears. He walked about, and when he said that his legs felt heavy, he lay down on the bed as the man had told him. And then the man, the one who had given him the poison, felt him, and after an interval examined his feet and legs. He then pinched his foot hard and asked if he could feel it. And Socrates said not. After that, he felt his shins once more, and moving upwards in this way, he showed us that he was becoming cold and numb. He went on feeling him and said that when the coldness reached his heart, he would be gone. By the time the coldness was somewhere in the region of his abdomen, when he uncovered his face, it had been covered over, and spoke, and this was in fact his last utterance. "Crito," he said, "we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt and don't neglect it." Now, the translation here, as often with classic texts, is bowdlerized. What's happening here is it's not his face that's covered, it's his groin. And what's happening is he's getting a hard-on. This often happens, apparently, with hemlock poisoning. And so it's a joke. Cock means the same thing in Greek that it means in English. I owe one last hard-on to Asclepius. So sacrifice a chicken to the god Asclepius. Asclepius, one of the gods Socrates revered, the god of healing, for perhaps one last hard-on and for healing me of this life. He said, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Please pay the debt and don't neglect it. It shall be done, said Crito. Have you anything else to say? To this question, he made no answer. But after a short interval, he stirred. And when the man uncovered him, his eyes were fixed. And when he saw this, Crito closed his mouth and his eyes. And that, Echecrates, was the end of our companion. A man who, among those of his time we knew, was, so we should say, the best, the wisest, and the most just. Well, I owe a cock to Asclepius. Asclepius, of course, One of the new gods, there is his cult was established. You can see it, as I said, if you go up the hill one side, at least to the Acropolis to visit, you'll pass by the temple to Asclepius. After it was too late, the Athenians regretted what they had done and erected a bronze statue, which has been lost to Socrates. There was found this small stone statue in the prison yard, which seems to be of Socrates, may indeed be a copy of that bronze statue. There's a report that Meletus was banished from Athens, also another report that he was executed for his part in bringing Socrates to his end, that Anytus and Lycon were also banished. Kind of hard to say. It seems like poetic justice. It seems like it should have happened, but we don't know for sure. They may just be pious legends. Xenophon ends his apology in this way. And if among those who make virtue their aim, anyone has ever been brought into contact with a person more helpful than Socrates, I count that man worthy to be called most blessed. And that Echecrates was the end of our companion, a man who among those of his time we knew was, so we should say, the best, the wisest too, and the most just. Well, now we've completed our reading of Plato, and in the next lecture, we'll jump ahead many centuries, and we will talk about René Descartes. So until then, good day.